What if we could step into a world so ancient that even silence itself seemed new? What if we could walk barefoot across rock, still cooling from a fire that had lasted 100 million years, and feel the weight of beginnings pressed against the skin of the earth? It is not a place we can ever reach by time or travel, and yet it lies all around us, beneath every continent, written in stone we rarely notice, carried in atoms that still hold their first memory of the sun. To imagine the Archean is to imagine more than a landscape. It is to imagine a state of being when Earth was neither young nor old, but a restless body forming its earliest breath. The air then was not the air we know. It was thick, metallic in scent, heavy with methane, carbon dioxide, and the faintest traces of nitrogen. Oxygen was not yet a whisper. To draw it into our lungs would be to choke, to fail almost instantly. But Earth favoured other life, life we might never recognise, tiny architects invisible to any eye we could picture, cells that built slowly, patiently, hidden in the shadows of stone and sea. They left no grand cities, no monuments in marble, and yet what they created reshaped entire worlds. The ocean stretched vast, restless, and strange. It was not the blue mirror we think of when we imagine eternity, but a darker, heavier body laden with iron in solution. If you could stand upon its shores, if such shores could even be called that, you would see waters tinted red and black, waves glinting like liquid metal in the dim copper light of the sun. To place your hand into it would feel like dipping into silence, a silence made not of absence, but of a chemistry still engaged in slow debate, still asking what can arise here, what can survive. And the sky, the sky may have unsettled even more deeply, for though the sun burned overhead, it was weaker then, fainter than the white blaze we know. 4 billion years ago the sun shone with perhaps 70% of its present strength. The contradiction, the paradox, is that Earth did not freeze. Instead, it trembled on the edge of balance, warmed not by kindness but by fluids rising through cracks in the crust, volcanoes pouring heat endlessly into the seas, and greenhouse gases thickening the air until the planet could hold a fragile shelter against collapse. Beneath that shelter, continents were unborn or just beginning. The crust fractured and folded on itself like broken glass upon water. Immense slabs sank into the deep, dragged downward by the first hints of plate tectonics. Magma rose and cooled and rose again, leaving behind fragments of land that drifted, collided, vanished. The continents we walk on today may seem permanent, but they are only the latest chapters. Beneath them lie the pages of Archean rock, the cratons, the roots of Earth's earliest attempt at stability. And yet, as we picture these landscapes, we are forced into humility, for to us, deep time is a language we can glimpse, but never speak. 4 billion years is not a scale the human heart knows how to carry. Our lives, our civilizations, even all of recorded history, these vanish against such expanse, and still the rocks remember. Isotopes of iron, of carbon, of zircon crystals the size of a grain of sand, they turn to us like archivists keeping records of climates, of atmospheres long extinct. They are the only surviving witnesses to dawn. It makes us wonder if the Earth holds memory in stone. What does it mean that we live upon it without hearing? Do we walk unknowing across libraries of dust, mistaking silence for forgetting? Or perhaps silence itself is the memory, refusing to fade, refusing to arrange itself into words we can claim. What if the Earth remembers in ways other than speech, through erosion, through mineral seams, through the slow shifting of plates that return what was once land back into fire? And always there is the question of perception. Would we recognize this Earth if we wandered into its dawn, or would the landscape seem so alien, so steeped in chemistry unlike our own, that we would no longer call it home? Perhaps what is most unsettling is that this was home. This strange world so distant from us gave rise to everything we are. Without it, there would be no thought, no voice, no story to tell. The Archean Eon is a place of beginnings, but also a place of erasures. Most of what happened then has been folded away, recycled by tectonics, buried by younger stone. Its cities, if ever they could be called that, are gone. Its forests, non-existent. Its oceans transformed. We hold in our hands only shards, and even those shards are worn, and yet perhaps it is their silence that holds the most profound invitation. For if this much can be forgotten, what else might linger? What else waits unremembered beneath the strata? And this is where the haze drifts in. The skies themselves, painted thick with methane, dimming and glowing in amber light. From here we move deeper into the Archean's atmosphere, into the cloak of haze that defined not only what life could breathe, but how the planet itself appeared to the newborn sun. The haze hangs heavy in our imagination, a veil stretched over the infant Earth, filtering the sunlight into strange copper tones. You would not see a blue sky if you lifted your head upward. Instead, you would look into an atmosphere so thick with methane that the day trembled between orange and gold, as though the entire dome of heaven was lit by a perpetual dusk. And sometimes, under certain angles, the haze would glow with an almost alien sheen, a place where shadows softened and the horizon blurred into fire. This veil did more than obscure, it shaped everything. Through scattering sunlight it kept the infant world from being too harsh, diffusing rays that might otherwise have scorched the naked rock. Yet it denied Earth the clear brilliance of starlight, hiding night beneath a permanent film. Imagine dreaming in such a place, never truly seeing the cosmos, never feeling the clarity of an open sky. This was a planet with its vision dimmed, and with vision dimmed, life learned how to grow in hidden places. Without oxygen, without ozone, ultraviolet light passed unhindered, dangerous and unfiltered. What life there was avoided the surface, clinging instead to shallow waters, to soft mats of microbial colonies that huddled under sediment for protection. They did not see in the way we see. They did not need sky or sun. They needed chemical companionship. In these waters they performed small acts of survival, pulling hydrogen from methane, balancing the delicate equations of energy in a world where oxygen was not yet imagined. And still above them the atmosphere brewed, slowly, endlessly, as if stirring itself toward a future not yet revealed. Scientists today search its traces in rocks that hold ancient isotopic fingerprints, carbon locked in ratios that suggest methane's reign, sulfur showing sequences etched in ultraviolet light. These are not direct photographs, no true windows into the past. Instead, they are chemical shadows, half-forgotten diary entries preserved in stone, telling us that haze was once the forest of the sky. Such a world must have seemed both still and restless. Still because the haze softened every horizon, turning distance into a muted blur. Restless because beneath it volcanoes hissed and seafloors spread and continents were rising out of molten seas. What if vision itself was altered here? What if perception, shaped by such amber skies, would not even think in blues and greens but in reds and darkened golds? How would identity feel if the permanent ceiling of life was a burning veil? There is something almost tender in the thought that this haze paradoxically protected what fragile life existed, not because it intended to, not because there was purpose, but simply because scattering light and trapping heat created a balance that held seas liquid longer than they might otherwise remain. Maybe life owes its survival to such dim skies, not to clarity, but to obscurity, not to openness, but to a veil. And perhaps there is a lesson there as well, that sometimes what conceals also preserves. The air was dense with unfamiliar chemistry. To inhale it would be death for us, but for the world then, it was a kind of womb. Methane and carbon dioxide absorbed and released warmth, creating a greenhouse strong enough to keep Earth unfrozen beneath a sun that shone weakly. We call this the faint young sun paradox, an irony written into astronomy and geology together. By all logic, the Earth should have been a frozen sphere beneath such faint light, yet it was not, and the haze, with its cloak of methane, was one of the answers. To imagine living beneath it is to dwell in perpetual twilight, where noon resembled an endless autumn evening. In such light shadows lengthened, and oceans glimmered darkly. The sky was a ceiling not to be pierced, not yet torn open by oxygen. What did this do to time's feeling? Did days blur into one another, less measured by light and darkness, more measured by the chemistry of tides and the rumbling of earth itself? And as we linger on this thought, another question rises. What else might such a haze conceal, not just in visuals but in memory? If Earth could hold secrets above its seas, what traces might still be hidden, unrevealed even to stone? To see the Archean sky is to understand that concealment is part of creation, that what is veiled still works, still shapes, still survives, and yet, if survival depends on such balance, what more might hide, waiting within the density of Earth's forgotten breath? For now we follow the sun through this haze, drifting downward toward the oceans that mirrored it. Oceans not of blue but of iron, carrying memory of chemistry still unfolding, waters dark and metallic seas, unlike any we can imagine today. And so, beyond the veil of haze, the world opens downward into water. Oceans vast, heavy and strange. They are not the blue we know. They are darker, almost metallic, infused with iron dissolved in unimaginable concentration. Imagine standing at their shores. If such shores could even truly exist, the horizon would not sparkle with familiar light but glisten like rust beneath the dim autumn glow of the Archean sun, a kind of liquid shadow stretching endlessly in all directions. To touch these waters would be to touch chemistry itself, a fluid in conversation with stone, always dissolving, always rearranging, forging slow histories beneath the surface. Here in these seas, memory is kept differently, not in the skeletons of great animals, not in reefs or corals, but in chemical balance, in mineral reactions. The oceans held secrets in colour. At times they shimmered red as dissolved iron oxidized in fleeting bursts when local conditions shifted. At other times they darkened into greenish hues, where sulfur and iron tangled together. Imagine a sea alive, not with fish but with chemical tides, the entire water body behaving like a living organism, its identity forever changing, forever unstable. There is humility in recognizing how alien this ocean would have felt. For us, the sea is a place of rhythm, of waves brimming with voices and life, but here it was quieter, lonelier, its soundscape thinner. The crash of waves still struck rock, yet beneath them the water rolled heavy and still, a silence broken only by chemical murmurs. Perhaps this too was a form of life, a precursor state, where the ocean itself seemed almost aware, experimenting with balance until something stable could emerge. And beneath those oceans, Earth remade itself constantly. Magma rose from fissures as new crust was born, only to be swallowed again at trenches where rock slipped beneath rock in the earliest episodes of subduction. The seafloor was not still. It was restless, carrying minerals downward into heat, returning them transformed as new stone. Each fragment of ocean floor lived only briefly before being cycled into hidden depths, recycled so thoroughly that almost no trace remains for us to study. The ocean floor was a page always being torn up and rewritten, a diary never allowed to finish a sentence. Yet through these restless destructions something extraordinary persisted. In shallow margins where sunlight filtered and muted could still touch the water, life clung to existence. Thin mats of microbes gathered at shorelines, constructing stromatolite towers, each layer a slow pulse of carbon pulled from the sea. Their chemistry changed the oceans gradually, slowly whispering oxygen into iron-rich waters, and when this oxygen met the dissolved iron, it precipitated into layers of stone, banded iron formations, painted as stripes of red and grey across the geologic record. Even today, these rocks lie in ancient cratons, reminders of entire oceans long swallowed, buried, gone, yet recorded mineral by mineral. The oceans were not only chemical vessels, but mirrors of time itself. In their waves lay the paradox of entropy and order, Currents dismantling rocks, spreading sediments, only for those sediments to be buried, hardened, lifted once more. The cycle erased constantly, and yet through erasure, it created permanence. Maybe identity itself works this way. Fleeting movements, repeated long enough, become stone. Could it be that the ocean's memory is more faithful than ours, storing billions of years in isotope ratios, in iron seams, in the texture of forgotten shorelines? We might ask what it would feel like to stand at such an ocean's edge. If such a perspective were even possible, would time itself feel different? Days half hidden in haze, nights blurred, an ocean neither blue nor inviting, a place where silence occupied every horizon. And if one paused then, if one watched how the waters shifted by light, how the chemistry breathed without creatures meant for our eyes, would it feel as if one were gazing at a world still in dream, not yet in waking? Perhaps what lingers most is not what lived there, but what did not. No whales, no corals, no shells ground into sand, no footsteps pressed into beaches. The Archean Ocean was a void filled with possibility, but largely empty of sound and shape. Its power was in what it carried unseen, chemistry preparing futures it could not imagine. Entropy working not as decay but as preparation, a sculptor smoothing unknown stages for what was yet to come. And so, wrapped in haze, resting upon these metallic seas, Earth dreamed. Oceans of iron and stone carried its memory, rewriting themselves with every surge, every rise and fall of spreading crust. And still above them, dim sunlight filtered through methane's veil. The planet was making not just an atmosphere and not just seas, but the first contours of rock that would endure, land, platforms, edges of continents. From oceans of iron we drift toward the next chapter, to find in stone the records of voices too faint for us to hear, rocks that hold the first language of the world. From the oceans of iron we drift now toward the stone, toward the fragments that rose and endured, the pieces that remain when all else is washed away. The Archean oceans built them grain by grain, sediment falling in silence, volcanoes layering basalt upon basalt, continents birthing themselves in fits of molten restlessness. And what we call rock today was then a fragile experiment, a language only beginning to form, etched not in words but in minerals, not in sentences but in crystals cooled from fire. To press your hand against one of these ancient stones is to touch something older than nearly all life, older than forests, older than bones. Zircon crystals, no larger than a grain of sand, have survived billions of years of subduction and resurfacing, still carrying within them locked isotopes, a clock beyond our comprehension, ticking patiently as oceans formed and vanished, as atmospheres shifted overhead. They are not merely minerals, they are storytellers, the archivists of deep time, whispering in half-legible scripts that scientists today decipher like fragments of an ancient text. The language of rock is not direct, not easy. It speaks in ratios of uranium to lead, in carbon signatures hidden between layers, in the iron seams of banded formations laid down in Archean seas. It does not say, "I was here," but something more elusive. It says, "The world was different then, the chemistry was not the same." To listen is not to hear events, but to feel conditions, the faint sun, the greenhouse haze, the first unstable continents trembling at the surface. Rock remembers differently than we do. It does not recall images or sensations. It recalls transformation. It remembers change. And yet how much is gone? The Archean earth recycled itself furiously. Vast slabs of crust descended into subduction zones, carried into the mantle, disappearing forever from our view. Most of the record is erased, pages of the diary torn and burned, leaving only fragments. We search for meaning in what remains, but perhaps the truer lesson lies in the absence, the silence between surviving stones. If nearly everything has been destroyed, what else might have once existed, untraceable, unthinkable? Perhaps whole stories of early landscapes, whole stages of life, are gone with no witnesses. The earth itself practiced forgetting before humans were ever here to mourn it. There is something strangely human in that forgetting. We too erase, remember in fragments, lose more than we keep. Memory is fragile, whether in minds or in minerals. Maybe what we call history is always only a scattering of shards, with the rest lost to entropy. And yet what is lost shapes us just as much as what is saved. The rock speaks, not because the whole story is intact, but because fragments are enough to remind us that time does not need completeness to be real. The earliest cretins, those ancient continental cores in Australia and Canada and Greenland, are like the Earth's scars, raised witnesses that refuse to be erased. Walking upon them is to stand on the edge of 4 billion years, to place your foot on ground that survived countless cycles of collision, rifting, mountain building and decay. They are the Earth's oldest words, still legible, still present, still standing against the erosion of eternity, and still we know for each survivor there are countless others that have crumbled back into fire. What if the stones themselves yearn to be read, to have their silence recognized? Could it be that they carry not only chemistry, but something like intention, not consciousness, but a kind of persistence, as if their very endurance is a message, not because they must be understood, but because survival itself is meaning, and if so, how should we listen? We look to isotopes, to mineral veins, to tiny inclusions sealed inside crystals since the planet's youth. We look to banded iron, to toner-like gneiss, to remnants of pillow lavas once frozen under Archean seas, and when we see them, we know that this is not a dead record. It is the closest thing to a pulse that deep time offers, a slow rhythm, a geological heartbeat across billions of years. The Earth speaks, not loudly, but always, beneath our feet in languages older than language. To walk across rock, this ancient is to feel your own life measured differently. 80 years, 100 years, even 10,000 years of human memory, all are nothing beside a zircon's measured patience. The humility is immense, and yet it soothes, because if we are small, the earth is vast. If we are brief, the earth remembers, and in that remembering we are not entirely lost. But even as stone remembers, it distorts. Rocks are recycled, bent, metamorphosed under pressures we cannot imagine. Memories are rewritten, blurred. What we have now is not the past itself, but a translation, a retelling carved by heat and pressure. Perhaps this is true of memory in all forms, that it changes with retelling, shifts with pressure, becomes something new each time. Could it be that the only way to endure is through transformation, not fidelity? And so we stand amidst these rocks, fragile mortals, listening to something ageless. They tell us not just of the world that was, but of the persistence of matter itself, the survival of fragments against overwhelming loss. Yet they also remind us how much has vanished, how much has been erased, and if so much can be hidden in stone, what more might lie waiting in other forms, the first breath of microbes, the rhythms of vanished tides. We will follow that trail downward now, into the air that life shaped, where small exhalations began to change oceans and stone alike, reshaping what the planet could become. From the rocks that held memory, we descend again into the water, to listen more closely, to witness something quieter still. Here in the Archean oceans, long before forests, long before animals, life had already found a way to persist. But it was not life as we understand it, not with lungs, not with oxygen, not with air at all. To breathe then was to breathe differently, to pull energy not from the sky but from minerals, from heat, from chemistry itself. These were tiny architects, microbes whose bodies were no larger than dust in sunlight, yet whose patience outweighed stars. They breathed in silence, in ways that seem alien to us. Some drew energy from methane, splitting hydrogen in the shadows of shallow mats. Others turned sulfur into sustenance, wrapping their entire existence around invisible exchanges of matter. Their universe was microscopic, but its consequences extended across the entire world. Slowly, imperceptibly, they were rewriting the chemistry of both ocean and sky. We often think of oxygen as life itself, But in the Archean, oxygen was poison. To these early microbes, oxygen was deadly, corrosive, a radical that tore apart delicate reactions. The entire biosphere lived carefully avoiding its presence. It is strange to imagine a world where the very molecule that allows us to breathe would have meant certain death, a substance to be hidden from, excluded, destroyed whenever possible. And yet, a few small organisms began, almost reluctantly, to release it, photosynthetic microbes that exhaled oxygen as waste, not because they intended to change the world, but simply because that was how their chemistry worked. Layer after layer of microbial mats grew at the edges of seas, producing oxygen that slipped into water tinged with iron. The reaction was inevitable. Oxygen met iron, and iron fell. Rusted minerals sank to the seafloor in vast sheets, layer upon layer, striping the ocean bed in bands of red and grey, banded iron formations. The silent monuments of oxygen's first whispers were born of this invisible exchange. Even today, when we mine iron from ancient stone, we are unearthing the residue of those first fragile exhalations, breath turned into rock. But this process was glacially slow, millions upon millions of years. For so long, oxygen never accumulated in the open air. The oceans swallowed it, the rocks devoured it. The chemistry of Earth absorbed it hungrily, leaving nothing free for the sky. Imagine a world where life is breathing quietly, endlessly, and yet the atmosphere above remains almost entirely unaware. Perhaps there is something here about patience too, that change unfelt in its time may still be overwhelming if allowed enough centuries to gather. Scientists seek the fingerprints of these breathless worlds in ancient isotopes, sulfur ratios that tell of chemistry performed without oxygen, carbon that records microbial feasts in shadows. They find evidence of entire metabolisms long vanished, lineages reduced to whispers in stone. And in studying them, we ask, what does it mean that we owe our existence not to creatures who breathed as we do, but to those who breathed without, who gave rise to an atmosphere they never foresaw? The Archean biosphere was quiet, invisible to any naked eye we might imagine. No forests, no flowers, no buzzing wings or footprints at low tide, only mats of microbes drifting, gluing sediment grains together, rising slowly into shapes that caught the faint filtered light. Stromatolites, those layered towers, were among the only visible traces of life. To us they seemed simple, unassuming structures. To Earth they were cathedrals of persistence, vast collectives building stone slowly, breath upon breath, until seas reshaped around them. It is easy to think of this time as empty, and yet perhaps emptiness is not absence but potential. Beneath every silence, a slow revolution was building. Microbes lived without oxygen, but by doing so, and by releasing it as unwanted waste, they set in motion one of the most profound events in planetary history, the Great Oxidation Event, still far in the future, still unimaginable under these amber skies. Life did not know it was preparing to transform. It simply lived breathing without oxygen, surviving in the way it could. And so we linger here, in seas both red and dark, where life worked quietly in forms we can hardly conceive. Breath was different. Survival was different. Patience was everything. The world above would not yet have recognized these acts as remarkable, but in memory, in hindsight, we see their magnitude. For without these microbes, without oxygen, first as poison and then as gift, there would be no us. Perhaps what we call breath is simply one variation in a long experiment, an experiment begun long before we were thought of, in oceans alien with iron and stone. And if breath itself can change, if what sustains life can shift so completely, what else can transform in ways we cannot imagine? If rocks can remember, and microbes can alter the sky, what might linger, waiting beneath the surface still unspoken? We will see traces of this patience in stone, the stromatolites, the monument layers, that reveal in physical shape how life wrote its presence across the planet, not with noise but with silence turned to form. From the whispered breath of microbes we turn now to their monuments, shapes that remain, long after the tiny beings who built them vanished. Stromatolites. Layer upon layer of microbial life pressed together, hardened into stone, rising from the shallow margins of Archean seas. Seen from above, they might not have seemed like much mounds of sediment lining the edges of tidal flats, clustered hills just beneath the water's skin. Yet these quiet forms became pillars of memory, durable messages from organisms too small to ever imagine permanence, too patient to call themselves creators. Each stromatolite grew one layer at a time, as filaments of bacteria reached for light, capturing carbon, building thin mats that trapped tiny particles of sediment. Another layer would form above, and another above that, until centuries became meters of stone. They were the first architects of environment, not because they intended to be, but because survival itself required that growth, that repetition, that unending patience. And over millions of years, these microbial landscapes slowly reshaped entire oceans. If you walked among them then, the world would not whisper of grandeur. There would be no forests, no towering creatures, no voices in the sky. Only stillness. Only the faint rustling of primitive tides washing in and out, brushing against these low, stony shapes. Yet beneath that stillness was consequence. The oxygen released by the microbes within was quietly altering the oceans, accumulating in stone as rusted iron, until at last it would overflow into the atmosphere. These layered domes, humble to the eye, were the true catalysts of planetary change. Even now, in rare places such as Shark Bay in Australia, stromatolites still exist, fossils alive, continuing their work in quiet shallows. To look at them today is to look into a mirror of deep time, to see a living monument that links us directly to a world nearly 4 billion years gone. They are not relics. They are continuities. They remind us that some things, through silence and rhythm, survive incomprehensible stretches of time, persisting where complexity has long since risen and fallen. What makes them haunting is not only their endurance, but their stillness. They do not move. They do not speak. Their growth is too slow for our eyes to perceive, captured only in geology's frame of reference. To sleep beside one would be like sleeping beside a clock that ticks once every 1,000 years, and yet in that pace, in that near invisibility, lies the secret of their strength. Not because they rushed, but because they endured. Not because they flourished loudly, but because they repeated themselves so patiently that they became eternal. Is it possible that silence itself is a form of memory, that what lingers longest is not the noise of a time, but its rhythm, repeated until it becomes permanent? Stromatolites suggest that persistence is its own language. They remind us that history is not always made by what is dramatic, but by what is repeated quietly, so quietly that at the time no one notices. And perhaps we too live within such patterns, where the smallest habits may one day outlive every gesture we thought was grand. Their presence in the geologic record feels almost like an echo of prayer, not because they intended reverence, but because their forms resemble chants written in stone, layer upon layer, verse upon verse, the same motion carried forward without end. To gaze upon them is to feel not only the weight of time, but the humility of scale. For our lifetimes are dust compared to theirs, our voices fleeting, ephemeral, our songs short-lived against their measure of geologic persistence. Stromatolites were not simply fossils of life, they were fossils of activity, of living worlds recording their existence in stone rather than in fragile bodies now lost. They made absence visible, turned it into form, and through those forms they carved silent bridges between the Archean and us. What else might survive this way? If microbes could turn their waste into monuments, if their patience could carve atmospheres, might life always find ways of engraving itself into matter, into minerals, into permanence? Could it be that all living things, knowingly or not, leave some trace that persists, even after memory falters, even after decay? Perhaps the earth itself breathes through such monuments, its long patience embodied in stone. And yet, even these enduring shapes are not invulnerable. Most stromatolites are gone, erased by newer ecosystems, eaten away when more advanced organisms appeared and grazed upon them. What remains is only a fraction, a scattering of survivors, an echo of their once global reign, which leaves us wondering if even the most patient monuments can be unbuilt. How much of life's earliest story have we already lost altogether? What vanished patterns do we not even know to miss? The answer may lie again in Earth's deeper rhythms, in fire, in stone, in the restless continents that rose and fell above these seas. For while microbes built, the planet itself was shaping other monuments, stories not of biology but of geology, continents rising as if to carry stromatolites into the light of future ages. And it is there, in fire and eruption, that the next vision of the Archean awaits us. While stromatolites layered their patient towers in shallow seas, another force was writing across the planet with a different hand, less fragile, less restrained, forged not from silence but from restlessness. Beneath the Archean's dim haze, the Earth itself was still young enough to bleed openly, its crust thin, fractured, trembling with heat. Volcanoes, countless and unceasing, rose and fell across the landscape, their eruptions painting the infant continents with rivers of fire. This was not yet the land we know. It was land always in flux, continents that appeared as if by accident, as if the Earth were still deciding whether it wanted them at all. To imagine the surface of the planet, then, is to imagine a world of instability. Immense plumes of magma, pushed upward from the mantle, piercing thinner crust, flooding across low-lying areas to solidify in black sheets of basalt. These black plains spread outward until they themselves fractured, breaking into shards to be carried back down into the mantle through subduction. Nothing was still for long. Where we now think of land as enduring mountains millions of years old, sediments piling into stable plains, the Archean was still experimenting. Continents were fragile beginnings, tested again and again in fire. And fire is both destroyer and creator. Each eruption buried what came before, but it also built something new crust, new landscapes, new hiding places for life. Shallow pools formed along cooling lava where microbes might have gathered, only for those basins to vanish again when the next eruption came. The planet was remaking itself ceaselessly, centuries collapsing into days, epochs compressing into moments. If we had walked upon such ground, our steps would have meant nothing. One eruption could erase all traces instantly. It was a world where memory seemed impossible, and yet fragments of that record remain, pressed into ancient gneiss, into cratons that still form the foundation of modern continents. Imagine the soundscape of such a place. Not the quiet forests we know, not the sound of birdsong or leaves, but the constant thunder of eruptions, black smoke unfurling into the methane haze above. Lightning crackled often within volcanic plumes, splitting the sky with veins of white-hot light. Ash fell like snow, smothering what little grew in low shallows, mixing with seawater into chemical brews that would linger in sediments. The Archean land was noisy, volatile, without permanence, and yet through that noise, stability was slowly emerging. Cratons, the deep roots of continents, began to coalesce, built from repeated cycles of lava and destruction. They were not wide lands at first, not fit for endless forests and rivers. They were narrow, jagged fragments rising above the waterline, islands of possibility more than any true homeland. Yet in those fragments something unthinkably important was happening. The Earth was learning to build memories that lasted. These cratons endured. They resisted complete erasure, and in doing so they have survived billions of years, carrying whispers from Archean fire to the present day. There is humility in knowing that every step we take now across streets, across mountains, rests atop those ancient foundations. Beneath us is fire that cooled, stone that refused to vanish, a persistence born not of peace but of struggle. Perhaps memory itself is forged this way, not gently, but through constant rewriting. Not because life intends it, but because what survives is what can adapt to destruction. Rock, like thought, Is pressure turned into permanence? Maybe we too, in our small ways, are constantly rewritten by fire we barely notice. Scientists today trace the signatures of these early eruptions through isotope ratios, neodymium, strontium, hafnium, chemical echoes that tell how magma once flowed, how crust was recycled, how continents first pieced themselves together. Each ratio is another fragment of the Earth's diary, etched not in letters but in numbers, proof that fire carried memory even as it devoured landscape. In looking at these signatures, we ask, what else might fire hold? What else might it keep that we have not yet learned to read? And so we dwell with the paradox. Fire destroyed nearly everything it touched, and yet, without it, nothing enduring could ever have been formed. Out of its violence, stability slowly emerged. Out of its noise, a silence that would last eons began to gather, and as continents rose more permanently, as the first stable lands spread wider on the restless surface, a different drama began. For above those newborn continents, a weaker sun still shone, faint, unkind, and filtered through haze without protection. Life on land was impossible, but the sky itself had begun to shape existence. The earth spoke first through water, then through rock, then through fire. Now it would speak through light as well. For even as volcanoes roared, the sun was casting its paradoxical presence upon this infant world, dim yet dangerous, faint yet searing without the shield we now take for granted. And beneath that pale and fickle sun, the Archean continued, whispering its story through silence and through change. Beneath the haze above the restless continents, there was always the sun. It was smaller then in strength, dimmer than the blazing star we know today, perhaps only 70% as bright. And yet, the paradox is this: though the light was weaker, it was far more dangerous. Without oxygen, without ozone, Earth had no shield. Ultraviolet light poured unhindered into the atmosphere, unfiltered by anything but methane haze. To live near the surface was to be exposed to strength that seared as much as it nourished. Imagine standing under such a sky. The day would not have been pale blue but copper, dim and uneasy. The sun a bright disk blurred through haze. Its warmth would barely reach your skin, and yet its rays would strike deeply, hostile to molecules delicate enough to be torn apart by ultraviolet touch. Life did not rise openly beneath that light. It hid, it sheltered, it clung to shadows in shallow water, beneath mats of sediment, beneath layers of its own making. Survival meant not basking in the sun but avoiding it. Here in the Archean, the light itself was both danger and invitation. The faint young sun paradox still challenges us. How did life endure when the sun burned with a softer flame than today? By all logic, the planet should have been frozen, oceans locked in ice, yet the seas remained liquid, warmed not by sunlight but by Earth's own internal fire, by greenhouse gases that wrapped the planet in a fragile balance. Methane and carbon dioxide acted as blankets, trapping warmth enough to sustain oceans and life beneath the paranoia of a weak sun. Warmth came not from generosity but from accident, yet accident was enough. Perhaps this is the lesson of the early sun, that fragility can be sustained, not because of perfect balance, but because of resilience, because life bends itself to whatever conditions come. Maybe it was not strength but adaptability that defined our earliest ancestors. They believed no myths about light. To them, the sun was no giver of growth, no parent, no god. It was an indifferent violence, too faint to warm, too harsh to trust. And so they turned inward, away from the open sky, working in shadows, living in patient exile until the world softened enough to allow breath. From time to time, the haze may have parted. The stranger light of unfiltered radiation must have broken through in more intensity, plunging shallow seas into sudden flare. Perhaps whole colonies were wiped away in flashes no eye would ever witness, and yet where some perished, others lingered. Life has never required perfection, only survival. Entropy always waited at the edges, pulling towards silence, but still microbes endured. They endured under clouds of volcanic ash. They endured under choking haze. They endured beneath a sun not yet kind. Geology holds whispers of these paradoxes in isotopes, in sulfur with signals etched by ultraviolet exposure, in crystals that grew beneath skies, both dim and toxic. By holding these records against the story of the faint young sun, scientists reconstruct not only what happened, but also how improbable it was that oceans remained liquid, that life carried on. Is it possible, we wonder, that the Earth itself conspired for continuity? Or was it only chance, gases, fire, mineral reactions, aligning briefly enough to prevent collapse? To us now, the sun is ordinary, almost taken for granted, a circle of warmth marking the rhythm of days. But in the Archean, each sunrise must have unfolded differently. The light was filtered, yellow-orange through the methane veil, casting eerie shadows on oceans tinted with iron. The sun rose weak but fell hard, driving unseen radiation into the surface, and perhaps this balance shaped time itself. Without familiar blue or clear night skies, days may not have felt separate from nights. Instead, an endless twilight may have prevailed, punctuated by the rhythms of volcanoes and tides more than by constellations shining above. The Archean sun teaches us something unsettling. Brightness does not equal safety, and weakness is not the same as gentleness. It was a sun dim enough to confuse, yet fierce enough to harm, a paradoxical star shaping life by forcing it underground, underwater, into shadows. Perhaps all growth requires such paradox, depending as much on what we avoid as on what we embrace. And when we think of this faint young sun filtered and unhindered at once, we are invited to wonder if memory itself is like light too, sometimes blinding in what it overexposes, sometimes dim in what it conceals. What if our perception of history works the same way, faint but still harmful, incomplete yet unavoidable? From sun to microbes, from haze to fire, the Archean story keeps circling back to patience and survival, and so we follow now toward the builders themselves, not human builders but the first engineers of matter, tiny cells that shaped minerals in ways almost architectural. For if the sun could burn harshly, life responded not with surrender but with invention, filling stone with patterns that outlasted time. From the faint and paradoxical sun, we return to life's hidden architects, the quiet builders who, through no grand design, shaped minerals into monuments more enduring than any intention. They were not engineers as we understand the word, not creatures of blueprints or cities, and yet through their chemistry they altered stone, atmosphere, and sea, leaving behind signatures more permanent than bones. They were the first builders, leaving technofossils inside the planet itself. Every cell was a laboratory. Each microbial colony performed experiments in patience, extracting energy from water, iron, sulfur, or light. In doing so, they exhaled byproducts that changed the material world. Some produced oxygen, releasing it reluctantly, a poison in their own time. Others mediated chemical balances that pulled elements into forms they would not have taken alone. Together they laid down stone as if by accident, layering mineral upon mineral until the planet wore their touch like a second skin. The most striking of these legacies are stromatolites, layered towers of stone built through the steady repetition of life upon life. Emerging first in shallow seas, they fossilized not the bodies of their builders but the act of construction itself, the quiet choreography of microbes arranging sediment, cementing it into permanence. We look upon their rounded domes and see not ruins, but instructions. They remind us that technology does not always mean machines, but can also mean persistence, repetition, the transformation of energy into architecture. Beyond stromatolites, there were other signatures, textures in rock known as microbial mats, ripple patterns shaped not by wind or tide but by life clinging together across surfaces. Banded iron formations, too, are the technofossils of these silent workers, Oxygen released into oceans met iron dissolved within them, precipitating as vast deposits that settled onto the seafloor in red and silver waves. Those iron layers, banded through billions of years, are records left behind by breath, breath becoming stone, waste becoming monument. What technology has ever worked so slowly, building continents' worth of resource out of invisible labor? There is something deeply humbling here, that the first technologies of Earth were not spears or fires, not engines or machines, but chemistry conducted by organisms without awareness of their consequence. A cell smaller than the width of a human hair remade oceans, carved records into rock, scripted atmospheres, without ever knowing atmosphere could exist. Can we call this technology, or is it deeper than that, an unconscious unfolding, proof that invention does not always require invention at all? Scientists sometimes use the word technofossil for the traces humans leave, the plastics, alloys, concrete fragments destined to endure long after us. But long before humans, the first builders wrote their technofossils too. They were not advanced, not deliberate, yet their structures survive still, embedded in some of the oldest stone on Earth. Perhaps technology is simply any interaction with matter that leaves behind a memory longer than the organism itself. By that measure, the Archean Earth was filled with technology, scattered across oceans too heavy to know its scale. And these technofossils are not silent. They still speak, if we have the patience to listen. In isotope ratios preserved within iron and carbon, we hear the faint echo of metabolic pathways now extinct. In filaments locked inside ancient chert, we glimpse shapes of microbial colonies, the blueprints of the earliest architectures. They are messages not of intention, but of persistence, and perhaps that is their lesson, that survival itself leaves behind monuments more profound than design. It is strange to think that we carry iron in our blood, iron first pulled from Archean seas, iron that once cycled through the hands of microbes. The red that runs in us is the red that once fell to the seafloor in oxygen's earliest communion with iron. We are walking techno-fossils ourselves, bodies shaped not just by time but by biochemical legacies from ages long vanished. Could it be then that every organism is a builder, leaving behind traces not always visible but always enduring, that the earth itself is a gallery of techno-fossils, some made of stone, some of breath, some of silence? Perhaps memory, too, works this way. We do not always intend to preserve it, but in repeating ourselves, in acting, we engrave patterns into others, into matter, into time. Though details vanish, traces linger, sometimes sharp, sometimes blurred, but never gone. And if microbes could transform oceans through patience alone, what more might have existed? Erased by deep time, could there have been other builders, other technologies, so thoroughly recycled by tectonics, by fire, by entropy, that not even fragments remain? Perhaps we are not the first to alter the earth in ways that will endure. Perhaps we are simply the latest, inheriting tools that life itself discovered billions of years before we drew our first breath. The builders of the Archean left behind no statues, no machines. Their monuments are silent bands of stone, layered mounds in shallows, chemical ratios hidden inside ancient crystals. But that silence is not emptiness. It is instruction. It tells us that technology need not be fast to be transformative, and that permanence is often carved by what is smallest, overlooked, invisible. And yet, if even microbes could leave technofossils, what else might be waiting beneath our feet, unrecognized, overlooked, entombed in stone? For every record we uncover, how many more have been erased? If permanence itself is selective, if memory chooses, then perhaps the earth still hides inventions stranger than ours, still waiting to be uncovered. And so we turn now from the builders themselves to what nearly erased them, to the silence of extinctions that almost claimed everything, reminders that what builds is always shadowed by what destroys. For every act of building there is the shadow of erasure, for every monument a silence waiting to return. The Archean world was no gentle nursery. It was precarious, restless, always on the edge of collapse. Life clung to margins, delicate mats of microbes in tidal pools, fragile chemistries drifting beneath the haze, and often the balance tilted against them. For every success that hardened into stone, many more disappeared without leaving a trace, written into waters that folded back on themselves, forgotten before they were truly known. Extinction is not an event, not always dramatic or sudden. Sometimes it is simply the quiet suffocation of possibility. Imagine colonies of microbes carefully weaving their metabolisms together, only to be drowned beneath new layers of volcanic ash. Imagine tidal flats once bustling with mats of bacteria, erased overnight as a plume of lava spread across them. Imagine slight fluctuations of atmosphere, the methane balance shaken, greenhouse gases failing to hold heat, oceans hardening at the surface, crushing fragile strands of life beneath ice. These moments came again and again, not once or twice, but perhaps countless times, and still life persisted. Or rather, some life persisted. Entropy was patient in its pursuit. Every fragile order was temporary. Every balance threatened by collapse into silence. Almost nothing in the Archean was stable. Not the continents still forming from lava, not the skies shifting under greenhouse gases, not the seas saturated with iron. Life existed within chaos, and chaos erased much of what might have grown. We know this not because we see the vanished forms, but because of what we do not see. Silences in the record, holes where whole lineages are absent, pages of stone showing no memory at all. Scientists speak of bottlenecks in deep time, moments where life nearly ends, where diversity collapses into a thin thread holding on. The Archean may have been a near-constant bottleneck. Entire branches of possibility could have been cut away before they even diverged. Could there have been early experiments in complexity already lost, erased without leaving fossils? Perhaps even entire chemical pathways of metabolism, vanished so thoroughly that we will never know they existed. The silence of the Archean is not just emptiness, it is censorship by fire, by ocean, by atmosphere itself. And yet, paradoxically, it was this fragility that shaped resilience. The survivors were those whose simplicity could endure, whose patience could withstand sudden collapse. Again and again, life faced silence. Again and again, it found ways to return from the brink. Perhaps extinction was not only loss, but also instruction, sculpting what was possible, teaching survival by subtraction. When we gaze into Paleoarchean rocks today, when we read their isotopic signatures, we are not only listening to voices that spoke, we are listening to those that never were. We are hearing silence just as much as sound. The quiet weight of extinction reminds us of our own fragility. Just as then, so now. Life depends on balances delicate beyond comprehension, the thin layers of atmosphere, the narrow band of temperatures, the flows of chemistry barely tilted towards stability. If we imagine arrogance in permanence, the Archean corrects us. Life has been nearly lost many times before. Entire oceans swallowed potential before it could be named. Entire continents scrubbed clean without mercy. Perhaps endurance is not natural, but improbable. Could it be that this almost erasure matters more than survival itself? That what shapes us is not victory, but the brushing presence of silence, the nearness of absence that almost claims everything? Extinction teaches humility. It reminds us that persistence is never guaranteed, that memory itself is fragile, that even the builders of technofossils lived under constant threat of being undone. If patience leaves its monuments, silence leaves its shadows, both guide us. The Archean, then, was neither only creation nor only destruction. It was the tension between them, the rhythm of survival played against the hum of erasure. And though we focus often on what survived, the stromatolites, the banded iron, the isotopes, the greater part of the story may be what did not, the erased voices, the abandoned experiments, the forgotten possibilities. If so much could be lost, what else might we never know? What memory might remain forever absent, vanishing into entropy as if it never was? And still, From that near silence came continuity. In the shadows of destruction, microbes endured, repeating themselves into stone, layering mats into monuments that outlived collapse. Against extinction's quiet, life answered with equally quiet persistence. Both forces shared the same stage, without which the story could not proceed, and as continents solidified, as surfaces became more stable, extinction's hand did not vanish, but gave way to something else. Land itself rising, breathing, shaping the next act of deep time. From the hush of near extinctions came another kind of endurance, born not of microbes this time, but of stone itself. The earth was learning how to hold its breath, how to steady fragments of crust long enough that they would not sink back into the mantle. The restless recycling of earlier epochs slowed just enough for land to linger at the surface, and in that lingering came permanence, a permanence so rare in the Archean that it felt like a kind of breathing. Continents first began to breathe. These earliest masses were not continents as we know them today. There were no vast plains, no wide deserts, no mountain chains stretching toward the stars. Instead, they were small fragments, narrow strips and jagged islands, stitched together by cycles of fire, cooling and collision. They were called cratons, the deep roots of modern continents, slabs of buoyant rock strong enough to resist the mantle's hunger. Unlike basaltic seafloor that vanished quickly into trenches, these fragments endured. Their density was less, and so they floated higher, like rafts pushing through Archean seas. In surviving, they became anchors of memory, the first steady ground Earth's surface had ever known. Imagine this world. Oceans still vast and iron-rich haze above still thickened by methane, and within them thin slivers of land emerging, volcanic in origin, black and jagged, ringed by steam. To walk upon such ground would be to feel both solidity and transience, as if the stone could dissolve beneath your feet, as if the crust itself were breathing, and yet within that motion something remarkable had changed. For the first time, land was no longer only transient lava flows, but land with roots, land capable of holding its presence across deep time. Scientists trace these beginnings in tonalite-trond hemite granidoirite complexes, the TTGs, rocks born of the partial melting of basalt deep below, pulled upward in Archean crucibles of pressure and heat. These TTGs form the heart of early cratons, records of a planet forging buoyancy from destruction. Their chemistry speaks quietly of what happened, that seawater and basalt sank together into mantle zones, melted, and returned as more silicic rock, stronger, lighter, capable of floating above the mantle's fire. This was the Earth learning to make continents, not in an instant but in cycles repeated more times than we can imagine. And what does it mean for continents to breathe? Rock is not alive, and yet, in its cycles of sinking and rising, its alternations of subduction and creation, it mimics the rhythm of lungs. New surfaces exhaled into being, old fragments inhaled back into the mantle. Breath was not merely metaphor here, but motion, a pulse that shaped the very possibility of life above. For without continents, waters would have covered all, and the chemistry of shallow margins, the places where stromatolites thrived, where oxygen began to gather, would never have existed. Continents were the stage upon which life could one day act more boldly, and yet even these were fragile victories. Continents were eroded quickly, worn back into the sea through endless rains, recycled in landslides dragged beneath restless plates. They did not stand as our mountains stand now, crowned with snow and forests. They were dark, weathered, thin, often drowned by rising swells, but they existed, and existence itself, against the hunger of the mantle, was a kind of defiance, a breath the planet had fought to hold. Perhaps there is something to learn in the slowness of their emergence. The Earth does not rush. Billions of years passed before continents rose with any permanence. The planet teaches us that endurance is not born quickly, that true foundations require trial, fire, collapse, and return. What we stand on today, the bedrock beneath our cities, has survived cycles of erasure beyond imagination. To walk on cretons is to walk not only on land, but on persistence made solid. And still we wonder how much of that first land is lost. How many continents rose only briefly, scattering away without trace? What shapes of earth vanished before they could become memory, erased so fully that even rocks forgot them? If land itself can disappear, how fragile is every other form of permanence? From these first breaths of continents, earth gained new spaces for water to fall, for rivers to carve, for sediments to gather. Rain, patient, endless, began eroding what volcanoes built, shaping valleys that whispered the earliest songs of weather. It is toward these rains we drift next, to watch how atmosphere and water etched memory into stone, to hear how droplets became archivists of time. From the first breaths of continents came the first conversations between sky and stone. As land rose trembling from oceans, the atmosphere above gathered itself into clouds, and from those clouds fell the earliest rains, steady, endless, patient beyond all measure. Droplets striking basalt, droplets cooling fresh lava, droplets sliding into seams already broken open by tectonic stress. In this simple act, the planet began to speak differently. Water became chisel, rain became memory, and Earth shifted into a new rhythm, one of weather-carving permanence. Imagine land so barren it held no trees, no roots, no soil. There was only naked rock, black and raw, exposed to a sky thick with methane and haze. Clouds, dense and heavy, gathered over these jagged surfaces, and then came rain again and again for centuries upon centuries. Each drop struck with force, carving atoms loose, carrying minerals into rivulets. Rivers did not yet flow in bends through valleys. They were torrents, floods consuming soft ground, racing toward the oceans that stretched endlessly outward. The sound of rainfall on stone must have been the planet's first lullaby, a whisper written not in voices, but in erosion's slow script. Over time, as rains fell without ceasing, the continents began to change shape. Valleys formed out of weakness. Softened ridges grew channels that deepened year after year. The atmosphere and the crust entered into dialogue. Carbon from the air washed into rivers, where it reacted with minerals, binding into stone that would one day serve as record of climate. These simple storms repeated endlessly, linked the sky to the ground, and began the processes that still anchor climate today. Weathering became the planet's first attempt at conversation between air and solid Earth. Scientists see evidence of this in isotope trails, carbon ratios within carbonates that speak of rain, binding air to stone, oxygen isotopes shifting to reveal cycles of rainfall and temperature far beyond memory. In these silent signatures we hear the echo of ancient rains, not the storms themselves, not their sudden power, but their persistence etched into minerals now resting quietly beneath our feet. The rain spoke, and rock remembered. Perhaps what matters most is not the violence of any single storm, but the repetition of quiet ones. Rain asks no permission. It falls whether land waits or not, whether valleys exist or not, whether anyone witnesses. In falling, it rewrites the world. And maybe memory works the same way, not as a sudden thunderclap, but as a steady rhythm, a return and return again, until grooves are carved not in stone but in thought. Could it be that we too are shaped more by the persistent than the extraordinary, more by the rains of little moments than by the floods of great ones? In those early epochs, the rain may have continued for thousands of years at a time. Oceans boiled with new inputs of sediment, rivers ran dense with minerals, and the surface weathered itself into softened forms. Perhaps the first landscapes recognizable as valleys appeared then, not dramatic mountains but shallow depressions, scars of water's endless migration downward. In their stillness we might imagine an echo, the first gesture of land responding, not to fire or mantle or tectonic violence, but to atmosphere, to weightless drops that fell endlessly from above. And always there was silence. No trees to rustle, no birds to sing at dawn, no frogs to echo after storms. Falling rain was sound enough, a constant percussion against raw stone, To us, rain suggests comfort. Sleep beneath its rhythm, dream under its lull. Perhaps the Archean held that same rhythm, pouring into the silence of continents too new to answer, a music of erosion, subtle, infinite, greater than anything it touched. Every groove carved became an archive. Every mineral carried away became part of a longer story, one in which weathering regulated both air and sea. Greenhouse gases were pulled from the atmosphere by this endless rain, balancing the faint young sun with chemistry drawn down into crust. Rain was not only shaping stone, it was shaping climate, life's probability, survival's narrow chance. If clouds had gathered differently, if balance had leaned too far toward loss, perhaps the earth would have frozen, and silence would have claimed everything once more. And so we stand now, imagining the echo of rains that have fallen for billions of years, patient and unrecorded by eyes or ears. They fell on rock that no longer exists, eroded into oceans long gone, written in isotopes carried forward into the present day. The rains of the Archean are absent, and yet not gone. Their memory remains not in sound, not in sight, but in the very shape of land beneath us. And yet, if water could carve permanence so slowly, if rain could etch history into continents not yet complete, what of the opposite force, decay itself? For just as rain records by wearing down, so entropy paints its own signature, undoing, erasing, scattering. From echoing rains we move toward another silence. Entropy as artist, sculpting not by building but by dissolving. From the echo of ancient rains we drift into an even quieter presence, one older than weather, older than stone, the endless patience of entropy. Where rain carved carefully, entropy worked endlessly, dissolving patterns into silence, scattering order into fragments, not because it intended to destroy, but because such scattering is the way of the universe. If creation was Earth's heartbeat, entropy was its breath out, a constant undoing, a return of all things to formlessness. And yet within that undoing, art emerges, lines carved by collapse, shapes revealed only through decay. Entropy was the first true artist of Earth. To witness the Archean world is to witness entropy at play in its rawest form. Rocks lifted high by magma flows collapsed under their own weakness, eroded back into the sea by rains and tides. Mountains that barely rose before crumbling remind us that permanence is always a negotiation, never a guarantee. Lava cooled into regular surfaces, only to fracture into shards, conquered by water slipping into cracks. In every detail, structure leaned toward dissolution, and from dissolution came new form, the shredded cliff becoming beach, the dismantled mineral becoming clay, the broken continent becoming sedimentary archive. Entropy's language was not destruction but transformation. It never erased without also creating new textures, new arrangements of matter. Life itself was born in this tension. Microbes thrived in niches carved out by decay, in hydrothermal vents where rock fractured open, in sediments where minerals dissolved, in overlaps where ocean currents distributed the crumbled dust of continents into chemical gradients. Without entropy's undoing, there would have been no possibility for such beginnings. What looks like erasure may, from a different angle, be tender practice, space made for something new. Scientists trace entropy in isotope systems where parent elements decay by irresistible law into daughters. Uranium to lead, potassium to argon, rubidium to strontium. Each transformation is irreversible, each ratio a measure of time passed without regard for witness. To us, these are clocks, but perhaps they are also artworks, atoms rearranging themselves into mosaics across eons, signatures of impermanence etched permanently into matter. Entropy paints quietly at the atomic level, turning nuclei from one form into another, leaving behind not absence but measure. The Earth speaks through this law of disorder, and we listen because its brushstrokes are unavoidable. Maybe that is why deep time itself feels so haunting for us. It is not time's enormity alone, but the ceaseless pressure of entropy that unsettles us, the reminder that nothing can remain unaltered, that silence will eventually come for all forms. But what if we reframed this? What if entropy is not an enemy, but an artist we have only misunderstood? The first seas were clarified by its work, stripping excess matter into balance. The continents hardened under its chisel, resistant fragments surviving only after being tested again and again through decay. Even memory itself, fragile in us, might depend on forgetting to find shape, as if erosion is necessary for identity. One might ask, can there be beauty in loss? The Archean answers with every fragment of rock still standing. Those cratons that escape total subduction are beautiful not only because they remain, but because they remain scarred, weathered, shaped by what they endured. They are not smooth, they are not whole, they are layered, folded, cut open, sealed again, each mark a brushstroke of entropy, a sculpting that teaches us permanence is never clean. Beauty is not survival without change. Beauty is survival through change. Perhaps this is why ruins move us in our own time. The broken arch, the scattered column, the weathered carving. We sense entropy's hand and recognize it as familiar. The same slow artist who shapes human ruins shaped Archean continents, stromatolites, even atoms themselves. To be alive is to participate in entropy, to become both artwork and fragment. Maybe that is why silence feels sacred to us at night. The quiet recognition that erosion, forgetting, and decay are not endings, but essential brushstrokes in the painting of time. Even life's breath in the Archean yielded to entropy. Microbes died by the countless millions, whole colonies erased in floods of lava or fluctuations of methane, and yet their fragments, layered stone, stripped isotopes, banded iron, remained. Entropy absorbed them into new forms, indistinguishable yet enduring. We too carry them in our chemistry. The red iron of our blood is one final curve of their brushstroke made permanent, pigments drawn from oceans undone. If entropy is a painter, its canvas is time, its tools are collapse, dissolution, forgetting. Its medium is silence, and though silence unnerves us, perhaps in it resides the most faithful record. Silence holds not what survived, but what could not, what was absent, what was erased, and absence shapes us as much as presence. The Archean whispers this: do not fear what crumbles. Fear, instead, the illusion that anything can be untouched. For the untouched is lifeless, the touched, the weathered, the broken. These breathe. And as we follow entropy's trail across stone and memory, we are invited deeper still to colour, to pigment, to the first hues Earth revealed through its chemistry. For beyond erosion's shadows, beyond entropy's brush, the Archean painted too, seas red with iron, mats of green microbes, stone black with basalt. Out of silence emerged colour, the Earth's first palette opening against the faint young sun. From entropy's hand of shadow, the Earth began to reveal something new, colour subtle at first, yet profound compared to the monochrome darkness of a molten, barren world. It was not the bright palette we know today. No blue skies, no emerald forests, no flowering reds or yellows. The Archean Earth wore a quieter spectrum forged from chemistry and stone, from iron and light. It was the first breath of colour, the earliest hint of how a planet might paint its own existence. Look first to the oceans. They were heavy with iron, and where oxygen met those waters, the seas flushed red as pigments of rust spread downward. Imagine waves not shimmering teal but stained with dusky scarlet, shifting tones from black-green shadows to streaks of blood-coloured shimmer under the dim copper sun. Entire bays may have glowed with oxidation, iron turning water into a liquid mural of red and grey. These variations were not decoration, but process, microbes breathing, oxygen meeting iron, chemistry sketching its lines in living colour. Then there was basalt, flowing endlessly from Archean volcanoes, cooling across continents still small and fragile. At night, when eruptions glowed on the horizon, molten rivers burned in orange luminescence before settling black, stone so dark it absorbed light, like silence itself. In contrast to the stained red of oceans, basalt gave the world its deeper tones, vast plains of muted black, where rain fell in sheets, where rivers slid across surfaces newly cooled. Between red seas and black rock, the Archean's palette was stark but honest, its contrast drawn from the very chemistry that defined it. And in the shallows, there was green. Not the green of forests or ferns, not vegetation that swayed in breezes, but the faint green of microbial mats spread across tidal flats, their photosynthetic pigments absorbing what little light filtered through the methane haze. To look at them would not be to see brightness, but rather a muted, earthy hue, the suggestion of life written in tones just a step removed from invisibility. And yet, this green would become one of the most important colors Earth would ever know, the shade of persistence, the pigment that transformed light into energy, waste into oxygen, silence into atmosphere. Colors then did not separate themselves into neat categories. No dramatic contrasts of sky and ground, no lively interplay of flowers and creatures, but rather bled into one another. Hazy copper skies pressed their tones onto seas, storms clouded everything in greys, lightning struck with flashes of white against black volcanic ash. A world painted not in bold symbols but in depth and shadow, in rust and basalt, in water and whisper. Perhaps it was less vivid, but perhaps also more elemental, as if Earth had chosen only a few simple brushes to begin its long mural of time. Scientists trace these pigments in banded iron formations, alternating red and silver-grey, locked in stone across billions of years. They study chlorophyll's primordial ancestors, the faint greens that once altered oceans. They look into the darkness of ancient basalts, reading chemistry to reconstruct flows once glowing bright enough to light the horizon. Through these fragments we glimpse the palette of Earth's earliest canvas, the color that entropy, rain, and fire conspired to reveal. And what does color mean when there are no eyes to see it? Does a red ocean matter if no witness marvels, no creature perceives it as red? Perhaps color exists first for the planet itself, not for perception but for process. A change of pigment in minerals is a change of chemistry. A layer of color in rock is a record of atmospheric shift. Color was memory before it was beauty, and maybe that is its truest form. The visible trace of forces moving through matter, the earth writing in hues what words could never hold. Yet, as we imagine this dim spectrum, we might wonder what other colors escaped us. What wavelengths lit the shallow water in ways no longer preserved? What living pigments have vanished completely? Could there have been blues we cannot recover, colors not in human sight at all, erased along with entire metabolisms? If memory is partly visual, then perhaps most of the Archean's palette will remain unknown, painted once upon the seas and then washed away. Even so, fragments endure. We see red in banded iron, black in basalt, green in stromatolite mats, and we sense something else also, that behind these colors was silence, the absence of contrast, the subtlety of a world still half-formed. From entropy's shadow into color's faint arrival, the earth was waking into sensation, and from color, the imagination drifts naturally to shadow again. Not what is seen, but what is forgotten, what might have been erased before we could ever discover it. Out of hues, we now step toward memory's darker corridor, the shadows of possible befores, worlds perhaps imagined and perhaps entirely lost. From the faint palette of the Archean, the reds of iron seas, the blacks of basalt, the muted greens of microbial mats, something else begins to stir in our imagination. For if so much can be erased, if whole colors and chemistries have been lost, then what else might have lingered here, now gone beyond recovery? The earth's silence feels too vast, its record too incomplete, for us to assume we know the full shape of beginnings. There may be shadows, echoes, remnants of befores we cannot name, shadows of a possible before. We tell ourselves that the Archean was simple, that microbes alone ruled, layering their mats, exhaling their wastes, reshaping atmosphere unaware. But this is only because simplicity is all that remains visible. What of the erased? What of life that did not leave stromatolites, that did not transform the planet in iron and oxygen, that did not harden its memory into stone? Could there have been lineages more fragile, more fleeting, that vanished without witness? Perhaps their bodies dissolved too quickly, their traces subducted into mantle fire, their chemistry folded back into silence. Survival, after all, is as much about luck as it is about persistence. The Earth erases itself constantly. The Archean crust was recycled over and over, whole terrains swallowed, never to return. Unlike later ages, where bones fossilize and shells endure, the Archean kept almost nothing of what it touched. This recycling means that nearly every hint of possible difference has been destroyed, leaving only fragments of the builders we already know. But absence too has a voice. Absence makes us ask what kind of life might exist for a moment, only to vanish completely. What might rise and fall untraceable, leaving behind only the ghost of possibility. Some scientists suggest that the Archean may have played host to entire metabolisms now extinct, forms of life that experimented with chemistries now inconceivable, using reactions we no longer see. They might have left no fossils, no oxygen, no rust. Their legacy could be nothing more than quiet niches emptied long ago. Others wonder if even complexity had a chance to bloom small and early, momentarily, in worlds so erased we cannot recover a single clue. Could life have flirted with multicellularity billions of years before it eventually triumphed, only to have that attempt folded into subduction? Could memory itself have roots deeper than stone allows? Philosophically, we are haunted by this possibility, that forgetting is greater than remembering, that not only are pages missing from Earth's diary, but entire manuscripts gone, burned without trace, before anyone could read a word. The Archean is perhaps the deepest corridor of forgetting we will ever face, billions of years of history erased, each gap wide enough to hold entire possibilities, and still we try to imagine what might have lived there. Could we be walking today upon the dust of dynasties of microbes, now completely absent, remnants of forms we never conceived? Could they have shaped landscapes differently, altered seas in ways erased so thoroughly we cannot imagine what vanished? We can only reach for analogies, for shadows cast by what remains. Stromatolites endured. Maybe other structures rose and fell without leaving stone behind. Banded iron accumulated. Maybe other pigments existed, painting seas in colors unrecoverable. Microbes endured in shallow light. Maybe others built their worlds in deep volcanic caves, vanished when oceans closed their vents. Each speculative thought circles not in certainty, but in invitation. The Archean teaches us to lean into silence, to recognize that what is absent shapes possibility more than what survives. Even now, with isotope clues and mineral signatures, most of the Archean remains unrecorded. Earth's memory goes quiet here, leaving only the faint suggestion of someone else turning the pages before us. As if each craton holds a library with most of its shelves empty, books reduced to dust, leaving faint fingerprints on stone. Perhaps what is haunting about the Archean is not how little life there was, but how much has been forgotten. And what if forgetting itself is part of the story? Memory and oblivion intertwined, absence shaping presence as much as continuity. Just as entropy paints with erasure, perhaps history itself requires its shadows, its empty corridors, so that what remains can have meaning. Could it be that forgetting is not failure but function, the Earth's way of refining memory? If so, then the Archean's lost worlds are more than accident. They are part of the art of becoming. And yet, there is unease. For if entire lineages, entire chemistries, entire ways of being can vanish so completely, how can we trust our own permanence? If the Archean hid worlds we will never rediscover, what guarantee is there that someday we too will not be erased? Our techno-fossils layered into silence, our cities folded beneath oceans, our memory dissolved into oblivion. What if we are ourselves only shadows of a possible before to something yet imagined, our presence temporary as theirs? The thought lingers suspended like haze at the horizon. From shadows of forgotten life, we move forward now to consider the fragile balance that allowed any of it to continue, the teetering climate of a faint sun and volcanic warmth. For life persisted not because survival was certain, but because Earth's climate held balance against collapse, a fragile equilibrium that endured just long enough. From the shadows of what might have been, we return to what allowed anything at all to continue, a fragile balance, delicate beyond comprehension. The Archean world lived always at the edge of silence, not frozen, not burned, but held in between by processes invisible and improbable. The sun glowed faint, weaker than today, carrying only about 2/3 of the energy we now receive. By rights, the oceans should have been locked beneath glaciers, continents entombed beneath silence, and yet they were not. The seas remained liquid, the surface restless, the air alive with haze. This contradiction is known as the faint young sun paradox, and it reminds us of the Archean's precarious stage. The warmth did not come from the sun, not fully. It came instead from below, from the Earth's own molten heart, from volcanoes spilling heat into the oceans, from gases released into the air. The greenhouse veil of methane and carbon dioxide was thick, trapping what little warmth could be held. Without this blanket, the seas would have frozen solid, but with too much they would have boiled away. Earth's earliest climate was not a steady design. It was a trembling equilibrium, delicate as glass, suspended in the abyss of possibility. Perhaps there is something to learn from this. Life does not require perfection, only a narrow corridor. Even instability can become cradle, if conditions tilt just so. For billions of years, the Archeans seemed to wobble on the edge, climate veering toward collapse, yet always drawn back just enough. Volcanoes injected more gases when the world grew colder, weathering from rains drew carbon away when it grew too hot. A subtle dialogue between land, sea, sky, and rock created a balance fragile and improbable. To call it accidental is to accept how little control there was. To call it destiny is to ignore how easily it might have ended differently. Scientists follow the trail of this balance through isotopes, carbon ratios that reveal how much was drawn down into stone, sulfur patterns marking hazy skies split by ultraviolet light. In these chemical breadcrumbs we see the wobble of climate, the closeness of collapse, the near misses that might have erased life before it gained strength. And perhaps what is haunting is not how stable it was, but how unstable, how survival came not from safety but from constant adjustment. Imagine living in that world. If living meant what it did, then tiny colonies of microbes clinging to pools. The climate they endured was no smooth rhythm, no quiet background. It was a fluctuating stage, seas rising or falling in chemistry with every volcanic plume, air swelling with haze, one era only to thin again the next. For them, balance was survival, and survival was waiting. Waiting through long centuries of near collapse, held only by the interplay of forces far larger than themselves. We might wonder whether the Earth itself sought this balance consciously, whether the planet, vast and unthinking, nevertheless acted as if it were a caretaker. Of course, science tells us the balance was chemical, not intentional. Rocks weathering carbon, volcanoes producing methane, oceans swallowing gases and giving them back. But perhaps intention is not necessary. Perhaps what matters most is that the planet moved always toward a narrow line between extremes, like breath caught just before exhale, held long enough for life to deepen its roots. And if the Archean world was so close to silence, what does that say about us now? We walk upon a planet conditioned by balance, yet we forget how temporary balance is, how knife-thin the margins of survival are. To reflect on this is not fear, but humility. We are visitors inside a system that wobbles more often than it stays steady, a stage of equilibrium that exists for long enough, but never guaranteed forever. Life has survived countless close calls, not because the Earth was safe, but because the Earth was balanced just enough. This balance was not only heat and cold, but memory itself. Subduction swallowed continents, recycling stone, erasing almost all record of climate. What we study now is less the reality than the echo. We reconstruct temperatures and gases from isotopes, from crystal inclusions, from faint signals left in stone billions of years old. Memory of balance is imperfect, and yet even imperfection teaches us that survival is narrow, that life exists only by chance repeated endlessly. And so we drift with that thought, that Earth was never generous, never certain, but fragile, trembling, sustained in instability. The Archean stood always at the threshold of silence, yet never fell entirely. Perhaps the abyss itself is what gave Earth its art, forcing it to stabilize again and again while life endured. From this precarious balance we turn toward the record keepers of such ages, the isotopes themselves, those atomic archivists of deep time, whose chemistry allows us to piece together this instability. For if the Archean held balance in silence, isotopes are the fragments that remember. From the fragile balance in the abyss we lean closer now, listening not to continents or rains or oceans, but to atoms themselves, tiny archivists, carrying their records longer and more faithfully than any stone. Isotopes, we call them. Variations in the same element, slight differences in weight, in composition, in decay, and yet these differences measured carefully reveal histories more enduring than words. When all else has been forgotten, when mountains have crumbled, when oceans have shifted their chemistry 1,000 times, isotopes remain. They are the planet's most patient memory. Imagine a zircon crystal, small enough to rest unnoticed on your fingertip, locked within granite billions of years old. Inside it, atoms of uranium wait, ticking slowly, turning step by step into lead by radioactive decay. The process has no rush. 1 billion years means nothing to them. Each atom transforms quietly, invisibly, and yet when we measure their proportions, parent to daughter, uranium to lead, we see a clock that began in the Archean itself. It is through such ratios that we know continents rose then, that oceans flowed then, that the faint sun shone upon seas that should have frozen but did not. Memory, turned atomic, continues to whisper through zircon. Or consider carbon. In Archean stromatolites, the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 records life's preference for lighter isotopes, creatures too small to know they were leaving fingerprints. To us, those fingerprints are unmistakable. They say life was here. They say chemistry was bent toward metabolism, not randomness. Fossils could not survive from so long ago, bodies too soft, stones too recycled, but isotopes endure. In their patterns we see metabolism in action 3.5 billion years ago, beyond sight yet not beyond hearing. The silence of erased bodies becomes, through isotopes, a language still legible. Sulfur, too, holds memory of Archean skies. In the absence of oxygen, ultraviolet light struck the air directly, splitting sulfur into anomalous isotope patterns preserved today in sediments. These patterns, called mass-independent fractionations, cannot form in modern oxygen-rich skies. They are chemical echoes of an atmosphere alien to us, proof of a time before ozone, when radiation poured unhindered and microbes hid beneath water to survive. Sulfur isotopes are that memory's last custodian, offering us not images but signatures numerical and precise, carved into matter itself. There is something haunting in this. Matter remembers what flesh cannot. Our own minds, fragile and brief, forget years, moments, even yesterday's details. The earth forgets in larger ways, swallowing stones in subduction, resetting its crust in fire, but isotopes remember through transformation, a paradoxical endurance born from change. They do not store memory in stillness, but in movement, decay, preference, reaction. Perhaps that is the truest way of memory, not resisting transformation, but being defined by it. And so we find ourselves wondering, is there meaning in the fact that time's deepest records are written so small? Why should it be that the memory of oceans rests in the difference between carbon-12 and carbon-13, or that the age of continents is carried by uranium quietly becoming lead? Could it be that the universe entrusts detail to its tiniest scales because only there does permanence exist? The vast collapses, the immense erases itself, but the small endures, humming out its ratio forever. Scientists measure these numbers with sensitivity we can barely imagine, layers of stone ground down, gases extracted, ratios plotted. The results are not dramatic images, not ruins or bones, but columns of digits, subtle shifts in mass. Yet behind the abstraction lies something profoundly human. We are listening to the oldest parts of the planet speaking. We are asking matter to tell us stories about itself, and matter is answering in the only way it knows, through isotopes, through slow decay, through variations held across unimaginable stretches of time. And isn't that too a form of poetry? Each isotope a verse, each ratio a refrain carried from one eon into another. Not because Earth insisted that it be preserved, but because nature cannot help but leave signatures. Nothing exists without leaving some trace. The trick is learning how to read it, learning how to soften our listening until numbers become memory. Perhaps this is what makes isotopes so moving. They are not fossils we can hold in hand, not structures we can look upon with awe. They are invisible to our senses, pure abstraction, and yet they reveal more of the Archean than any museum display. They remind us that memory does not have to be beautiful to be profound. Numbers are not sterile when we learn what they signify. They are voices, low and steady, telling us oceans lived here, atmospheres shifted here, continents breathed here. And yet, for all their patience, isotopes do not give us completeness. They give us hints, fragments, values written in decimals. They open doors but never show the whole room, which leaves us again with silence. The space between records, the memories even isotopes cannot hold. If atoms remember through decay, what of the music of absence, the lives erased so fully that no ratio carries them forward? From isotope whispers, we now drift towards something even quieter. The soundscapes themselves, the music of a world before voices, before forests, before animals filled the air. Not what was recorded, but what was never there to hear, the music of absence. From the whispers of isotopes we move into an older silence, a silence not of numbers but of sound. For the Archean world had no birds, no cicadas at dusk, no forests to shiver in the wind, no animals filling nights with breath and rustle. It was a world almost without voice, and yet not entirely. There were sounds, deep, elemental, arising from the earth itself, but they were few, sparse, and strange. The music of the Archean was the music of absence. Imagine walking the shoreline of an Archean continent, newly risen and raw. You would not hear the chatter of life, not footsteps, not buzzing wings. Instead, there would only be the crash of waves, heavy with dissolved iron, a lower, more metallic sound than today's oceans, thicker in tone. There would be the hiss of volcanic vents, steam unfurling into haze. Occasionally the crack of lava cooling into fragments, stone breaking as it hardened. These were the sounds of a world not yet filled, not yet diverse, not yet busy. They would echo wide, linger long in the empty air. Silence stretched between them, making each sound heavier, every rhythm magnified. Perhaps the most constant undertone was volcanic. Eruptions were frequent, plumes of ash roaring upward, magma seething into oceans. The earth rumbled almost continually, the voice of its still young heartbeat audible through fire and fracture. And yet even this thunder felt spacious, countered by the long stretches of nothing, where only wind moved across bare rock. Wind without trees is different. It does not rustle or whisper, but passes hollowly, whistling against stone. The Archean's wind may have been the loneliest sound of all, carrying no leaves, no grasses, no creatures to break its path. And so the soundscape of the Archean was thin, fragile, not music full of melody, but a sparse score, wave crash, wind, distant eruption, silence. Microbes themselves made no sound loud enough for us to imagine. Their great works, exhaling oxygen, building stromatolites, were not voiced but geological, marked in stone, not in song. To walk there would be to feel acutely the immensity of silence, an earth waiting for its choir. Is it possible that absence is its own form of music? That what we call silence is not empty but spacious, creating room to feel what is there more deeply? The Archean teaches us that sound is not required for significance. A world can be alive yet nearly motionless to the ear. Perhaps it is in absence that sensitivity heightens, where a single crack of cooled rock resounds like a symphony within the vast stillness. Scientists cannot resurrect these soundscapes directly. Rock records isotopes, not vibrations of air, and yet we infer them. By reconstructing volcanic frequency, by estimating the waves of iron-heavy seas, by picturing methane-laden winds moving across bare continents, we can imagine the Archean's quiet orchestra, a deep bass of tectonic breath, a light percussion of rainfall on naked rock, and long silences filling all the space between. In some ways, it is truer music than ours, slower, deeper, more patient. And here lies the wonder, that we are moved by silence even in imagination, that a planet before animals, before forests, can move us, not because of what is heard, but because of what is not. The music of absence is an invitation to stillness, to reflection, to humility. It reminds us that life did not begin in noise but in quiet repetition, that all our present clamour emerged from patience unheard. Perhaps this too is why sleep comes easier when rain falls, or when wind moves gently through night. We are attuned somehow to this older soundscape, remembering unconsciously the Archean nights where such few tones wove us into the world. Our rest taps into an ancient lullaby, water, wind, and silence broken only by fire. And if silence could hold such weight then, might it still hold truths now? What if absence speaks louder than presence, shaping us more than we suspect? The Archean lives in us not as melody but as rhythm, patience between sounds, stillness between events. That stillness leads us onward, toward the next transformation, the rise of oxygen itself, creeping like an invisible chorus, reshaping air and sea, bringing both promise and danger. From silence into breath, from absence into atmosphere, we drift now toward that oxygen vision, awaiting in the deep future of the Archean. From the sparse soundscape of the Archean, we shift to a transformation that began invisibly, almost shyly, yet became the most momentous act in Earth's history. Oxygen, not suddenly, not in a single breath, but in fragile increments, exhaled into water and air by microbes no one could see. To them this gas was waste, a byproduct, an inconvenience. To the world it was destiny. Oxygen crept patiently into existence, reshaping chemistry grain by grain, cloud by cloud, until the entire planet began to lean toward a different future. At first its presence was danger. Most of the biosphere, then those early microbial empires, had evolved in a world without oxygen. They depended on methane, iron, sulfur. For them, oxygen was not life but poison, a molecule too reactive, too violent, tearing delicate bonds apart. Colonies that had thrived for millions of years suddenly found themselves exposed to something corrosive, something that ate away at the very chemistry of their survival. To breathe, in our sense, was impossible then. To inhale oxygen was to drown on land. And yet, slowly oxygen accumulated, not because life intended it, but because a few small organisms practiced photosynthesis. Using pigments to trap light, they split water molecules and released oxygen into their surroundings. With each cycle of sunlight captured, another exhale. With each layered mat of stromatolites forming in shallow seas, more waste gas crept out into water heavy with iron, and iron, waiting, rusted. Band after band of red minerals fell to the seafloor. Iron formations layered across the ocean bed like enormous ledgers of unseen respiration. Entire mountain ranges today are built from those respirations. monuments to waste turned monument. Scientists call this transformation the Great Oxidation Event, though at the time it was neither single nor swift. For millions of years, oxygen remained bound, swallowed by oceans, absorbed into rocks, kept from the sky. Only once those sinks filled and overflowed could the atmosphere itself begin to change. Slowly the balance tipped. Oxygen began to escape the sea and rise into the air. The skies shifted. The chemistry of everything shifted. It was not merely an addition, but a revolution written at the smallest scale, molecules recombining, atoms shuffling partners in ways impossible before. What must it have felt like, had there been witnesses? A planet gradually turning strange, known chemistries disrupted. Microbial communities long dominant retreating, collapsing, pushed into shadows. Extinction on a massive scale, though invisible to us now. The planet itself, once cloaked in methane haze, grew clearer as oxygen cut through the veil, altering sunlight's passage. Copper skies dimmed, blue began to emerge faintly, a subtle foreshadow of skies more familiar. The Earth was entering a new era, a vision of atmosphere reshaped by what had once been considered waste. There is humility in realizing that our very breath today is possible only because of this long, patient poisoning. The oxygen that sustains us was once catastrophe. The sky we look into for peace was once unimaginable to the archetypal eyes of microbes that fled from its rise. What is life's gift, but also life's undoing? Perhaps this is a pattern repeated over and over: creation for one is death for another. Progress is also forgetting. Survival for some requires extinction for others. In isotope records, we read this vision still. Sulfur patterns shift abruptly, no longer shaped by ultraviolet light alone. Carbon in ancient rocks reveals the rise of oxygen in burial cycles. Iron locks into stone, as if the oceans themselves exhaled red into the rock layers. These clues are fragments of a song too slow for direct listening. But in their patterns we hear the chorus. Oxygen came, oxygen stayed, oxygen remade the world. And yet even this vision was not final. Oxygen's rise was sporadic, punctuated by crashes and stalls, epochs when methane surged again, balance tipping backward. It was not instant triumph, but hesitant negotiation. Over and over, oxygen advanced only to retreat, surged only to fall. And so, like all great visions, it unfolded gradually, fragile, uncertain, but persistent, until persistence itself became permanence. Could it be that history always works this way? That visions never arrive whole, but creep slowly, resisted, erased, hidden, before they unveil themselves fully? The Great Oxidation was not a sudden dawn, but a series of flickers across time. Small lights eventually brightening into a world we recognize. Perhaps our own lives too unfold in such fits and starts, visions fragile before they are secure, persistence giving shape to what seems impossible at first. And with oxygen's quiet triumph, the Earth grew different, sky awaking, oceans altered, metabolisms shifting. But with this change came another presence, its twin forgetting. For if oxygen gave memory in stone, it also erased the worlds that had been before. The shadow of what oxygen destroyed remains forever silent. And so we turn next, not to creation, but to absence. Once again the shape of forgetting, the contours of what vanishes so thoroughly, all we can do is imagine it might have been. From the quiet vision of oxygen, we arrive at its shadow, forgetting. For every new breath carved into stone, countless older breaths vanished. The history of the Archean is less about what we know than what we cannot know, less about what is remembered than about what is lost. Layers erased by subduction, bodies dissolved before they could fossilize, chemistries overwritten by later worlds. Forgetting has a presence here, a shape that feels as real as stone itself. It is unsettling to realize that almost everything of the Archean is gone. Not only creatures and colonies, but landscapes, oceans, skies. The continents of that time are mostly folded back into the mantle, the diaries of early Earth burned before they could be read. What remains are fragments, rare zircons holding isotopic ratios, banded iron frozen into ridges, stromatolite towers still standing in shallow bays, shards, no more. We build entire stories on fragments less than 1% of what once was. The rest is silence. And yet silence has form. Forgetting is not absence alone. It shapes memory by what it removes. Think of a story missing its beginning, a song interrupted mid-verse. The absences guide imagination, force us to lean into the void. Perhaps the Archean is most powerful, not for what it tells us, but for what it conceals, for the spaces too wide to ever fill. In the shape of forgetting, we see invitation to wonder, a vast openness where speculation blooms. Is it possible that forgetting is necessary, that without it there could be no space for what comes after? If every record endured, if every page of Earth's diary remained, where would new stories fit? Subduction erases, but in erasing, makes room for fresh crust. Volcanism destroys, but in destruction creates new land for rivers to carve anew. Erosion wears away shape, but in softening builds sedimentary plains that can hold future forests and seas. Forgetting on Earth is not only loss, it is function, a cycle that shapes the very possibility of memory. In our own minds, too, forgetting has shape. Not all memories remain. Many slip under, joining silence. Sometimes the ones we keep grow distorted, folded by pressure like rock. Maybe the Earth and we are not so different. Both carry layers, both keep fragments, both lose more than they save. Perhaps this is the cost of existence itself, that to be is to forget, and maybe without forgetting, identity could never grow. The Earth forgets through subduction. Swallowing continents whole, it forgets through metamorphism, rewriting rock structure under heat and pressure until the original story is unrecognizable. It forgets through erosion, dissolving mountains back into grains of sand. It forgets by silence, leaving us with no clue at all. And yet in every case something lingers. A zircon crystal too stubborn to melt, a chemical ratio too subtle to erase. The tension between memory and oblivion is what gives deep time its resonance. Perhaps what troubles us is not the loss itself, but the unknowable. Could there have been forms of life that left no technofossils, no isotopic whisper, nothing? Could there have been entire chapters of possibility erased so thoroughly that not even imagination can resurrect them? When we say we do not know, what we really mean is we have only silence. The shape of forgetting is to trace the edge of that silence, to circle it with questions until, like fog, it reveals not clarity but vastness. And still forgetting is not complete. We live because not all was erased. Stromatolites remain. Isotopes speak faintly. Iron remembers oxygen's first kiss. There is comfort in knowing that, even against entropy, some memory persists, even if broken, even if incomplete. Perhaps the shape of forgetting is not erasure, but pattern. Some things vanish, some remain, and the rhythm matters more than the detail. Our civilizations, too, will one day vanish. Our languages, cities, maps, the things we treasure most may dissolve into the mantle or scatter to dust. What survives will be fragments. What endures may be no more than a thin seam of altered stone, a stray isotope ratio noting our presence. To future ages we may be as brief as microbes in a shallow Archean bay, but we will have left something. Even forgetting cannot take everything. And so, from this meditation on absence, we turn toward what remains, the fossils not of creatures but of atmospheres, of fire, of silence pressed into rock. For though life is fragile, records linger in strange places, markers of past worlds hidden in layers of stone. These are fossils too, though not of bone but of chemistry, reminders that no forgetting is ever absolute. From the shape of forgetting we drift forward into the fossils of worlds gone quiet. From the shape of forgetting we move into what remains, into fossils unlike the ones we imagine today. The Archean left no bones, for there were no bodies to harden. It left no shells, no forests, no footprints pressed into tidal mud. What endured was quieter, stranger fossils not of creatures but of fire and silence themselves. The record of those ancient worlds lives in chemistry, written not as forms but as layers, colors, bands, isotopes. The Earth's diary then was not a book of animals but a book of atmospheres, eruptions and oceans turned to stone. Consider the banded iron formations, layer upon layer of rusted red and silver grey, laid down when oxygen first met the iron-rich Archean Sea. These stripes, still rising in outcrops across Canada, Australia and South Africa, are fossils in every sense. Not of beings with bones, but of reactions repeated for millions of years. They are fossils of breath, microbial oxygen meeting iron, forming rust, falling into seafloors in silence. We quarry them now, mine them, build our cities from their substance, and yet few pause to remember what they are. Immense archives of vanished seas sighing through the chemistry of stone. Or think of pillow basalts, hardened mounds of lava that froze beneath ancient waters, round shapes locked forever in stone. They are fossils of fire meeting sea, eruptions swallowed by ocean's cooling hands. Their forms recall the precise moment of encounter, molten liquid rushing out from Earth's throat, quenched by Archean tides, preserved by chance. They are not life, but they reflect a kind of living motion, the Earth caught in the act of becoming, sculpted into permanence by the very water that sought to erase it. Within sediments we find traces of sulfur isotopes, anomalies that whisper of a sky without oxygen, split by ultraviolet light, sealed into mineral form. These isotope imbalances are the fossils of atmosphere, invisible yet undeniable, preserved as absence shaped into ratio. Every study of those sulfur signatures is like opening a time capsule, not of fossils shaped like bodies, but of skies shaped like memory. They are fossils of silence, reminders that even air leaves its imprints when conditions change enough. What makes these fossils extraordinary is not their form, but their function. They remind us that fossilization does not always mean body. Sometimes it is environment that fossilizes, event that fossilizes, silence that fossilizes. The Archean, with its scarcity of physical traces, teaches us to broaden what we mean by record. Fossils do not always look back at us with familiar outlines. Sometimes they are whispers hidden in bulk rock, patterns read only through numbers, clues accessible only if we learn to listen differently. Perhaps these fossils of fire and silence are even more profound than bones. Bones speak of individuals, single lives, single creatures, but these records speak of entire worlds, atmospheres changing, oceans oxidizing, fire erupting across continents. They are fossils not of living things but of conditions, fossils of possibility itself. In their silence, they tell us stories larger than ourselves, larger even than life as we know it. And what is haunting is how quiet they are. To hold a chunk of banded iron is to hold hundreds of millions of years in your palm, the product of countless breaths you cannot see. To brush your hand across pillow lava is to touch frozen eruptions stilled in the middle of transformation. These are monuments of processes that never intended to record themselves, yet could not help but leave traces. They remind us that memory is not only in living forms, but in the planet itself, in its chemistry, in its scars. And still, fossils of fire and silence leave questions unspoken. What other records were erased, folded back into mantle fire? What oceans rusted so completely their story is gone? What other skies, with chemistries unfamiliar, passed over Archean seas without leaving isotope trails? If these are the fossils we can see, how many more remain invisible, lost entirely in Earth's cycles of forgetting? From these silent monuments we are drawn again to ourselves, for we too will leave fossils, our cities, our metals, our plastics, layered into future stone. But beside the grandeur of Archean archives, our remains will perhaps seem small. Time will decide what is remembered as fossil, and what is swallowed as silence. And so, from these strange fossils we drift onward into the wide mirror of reflection. For to gaze into this age is also to gaze into ourselves, to face what deep time reveals about memory and identity. This is where the Archean becomes less alien and more intimate, not history alone, but a mirror of human fragility. It is toward that mirror we go next. From fossils of fire and silence, the Earth offers us something subtler still, a mirror, not polished, not clear, but vast. A mirror made of time itself. To gaze into the Archean is to gaze not into colour or form, but into duration, into billions of years beyond perception. It reflects us not in detail, not in likeness, but in scale, in humbling contrast. And in this reflection, we may see ourselves differently than we ever imagined. When we look into deep time, we confront our brevity. A human life is a flicker measured against 4 billion years. A civilization, even the longest, barely registers eras of stone and fire cycle endlessly, while our histories are only dust settling in between. And yet, within that brevity, the reflection becomes sharper. We see how precious each moment is, how improbable our presence becomes when set beside such duration. Just as isotopes whisper across ages, our memories whisper across days, fragile, fleeting, almost erased before they are known. The Archean tells us, without judgment, that we are temporary, but it also tells us that being temporary is not failure. It is simply the nature of existence. Consider the survival of zircon crystals, carrying time older than any mountain, any continent we now walk upon. A grain of sand can outlast entire species, entire lineages, even entire oceans. That endurance reflects back on us, not to diminish our lives, but to remind us that permanence does not belong to flesh. We are not meant to endure like minerals. Instead, we are meant to remember, to feel, to connect our smallness to the vastness. The mirror teaches this endurance and brevity are not opposites, but companions. The long arc of rock makes meaning of the short arcs of life. There is also humility in seeing that the Earth forgets more than it remembers. The Archean holds only fragments, crumbs of evidence stitched into narratives with wide gaps between them, and yet those fragments are enough. In that there is reflection too. Our minds also forget. Our lives also lose more memory than they keep. We tell stories from fragments we reconstruct from partial traces. The Archean is not only a mirror of time, it is a mirror of the mind, revealing how remembering and forgetting are woven into the same cloth. Could it be that deep time reflects less about what the Earth was, and more about what we are? Perhaps what unsettles us is not the emptiness of billions of years, but the recognition of ourselves inside it, our own uncertainty, our fragility, our partialness mirrored back through the silhouette of vanished oceans and eroded lands. We do not just study the Archean, we project into it our patterns, our needs, our longing for permanence where permanence does not exist. The mirror shows us this longing and how small it is beside the scale of stone. And yet, inside that humbling recognition, there is peace. For to face deep time is to release the weight of permanence, to understand that significance is not measured in endurance, but in participation. Microbes of the Archean did not endure as individuals, yet their collective breath reshaped the world. Our own lives, brief as they are, may also ripple outward, not always in ways we can measure. The mirror shows us that transformation is meaning enough, even when permanence is denied. Standing before cratons holding iron formations, tracing isotope ratios, we see in the Earth both memory and amnesia, presence and loss. We see ourselves mirrored, creatures who long to be remembered, yet who will inevitably be forgotten, except for fragments that endure by accident more than intention. The Archean reminds us to soften into that rhythm, to find beauty in being part of a continuity we cannot control. The Archean mirror is not a polished image of our faces, but a dim reflection of our place. It tells us, you are brief, but you are part of a story billions of years long. You are fragile, but fragility is how life persists. You will be forgotten, but forgetting is part of memory's shape. Every glance into deep time is ultimately a glance into ourselves, refracted through silence and distance, sharpened by humility. And so, from this great mirror, we let our eyes follow the reflection outward to see how fragments of Archean stone still surface in our present landscape. For through these rare survivors, these pieces of earth that endured, we are able to walk directly upon that ancient dawn, to feel with our own hands what remains of its vanished world. From mirror to landscape, we move forward into places where deep time still touches us directly beneath our feet. From the deep mirror of time, we step softly into the present, where fragments of that forgotten dawn still break the surface. The Archean has not entirely vanished. It lingers as echoes beneath our feet, in certain landscapes where the oldest cretins have resisted both subduction and silence. To touch such stone is to bridge billions of years in a single gesture. To walk upon them is to enter a dialogue with ages so vast that language itself falters. In Greenland, the Isua Greenstone Belt rises, carrying rock formed nearly 3.8 billion years ago. Here, the crust of Earth's earliest oceans remains exposed, carrying microfossil whispers preserved as graphite inclusions, possible traces of life from a time when oxygen was still an unimagined poison. Standing there, one might feel the ground breathing differently, as though the weight of deep time presses beneath every step. Winds sweep cold across stone older than continents elsewhere, and silence spreads outward, echoing what it has always carried: patience, endurance, survival. In Australia, the Pilbara Craton reveals itself, scarred yet resilient, home to stromatolitic structures fossilized from Archean seas. To see these layered domes is to gaze upon monuments not made for us, but made through repetition. Microbes building upward for millions of years simply to live another day. Even now, in Shark Bay, living stromatolites persist, linking present to Archean, alive relics of an age otherwise erased. Their forms are not grand, yet their quiet persistence unsettles us with humility. A mound of layered sediment is at once subtle and immense, a fossil, a process, a memory. In Canada, the Slave and Superior cratons tell of ancient collisions, fragments that have drifted but endured. Beneath boreal forest and northern lakes lies tonalite and gneiss that once formed the earliest continental crust. Isotope ratios from zircons here confirm ages as old as 4.0 billion years. To look upon these stones is to confront the sheer improbability of their survival. Most Archean crust is gone, consumed back into the mantle. Yet here, somehow, fragments endured all cycles of destruction, bearing witness through silence. These scattered places are like portals. Ordinary on the surface, they do not announce their significance with grandeur. They are hills, outcrops, quiet ridges. People walk across them unaware of the hidden weight beneath. And yet, when we know their age, when we remember that these rocks are older than forests, older than bones, older than oxygen, the landscape transforms. Each step becomes heavier, as though the earth itself leaned close to whisper, "Remember where you are." Few places allow us to hear such echoes so directly. Perhaps what moves us is not only survival but endurance through erasure. Every Archean rock we hold has resisted billions of years of weathering, glaciation, erosion, tectonic recycling. Each fragment is improbable, and improbability magnifies significance. Just as one surviving journal entry hints at the silence of an entire burned library, these surviving stones hint at the erased continents, the lost oceans, the vanished atmospheres. What we see is not fullness, but fragment. And yet the fragment is enough to stir awe. Is it possible that the echoes linger in us too? When we stand upon these cratons, do we not feel a subtle resonance, the sense of scales far beyond our own? Human memory ends in centuries, perhaps millennia, but to place a hand on Archean rock is to touch 4 billion years in an instant. Our bodies, our lifetimes, shrink in comparison. Yet instead of despair, a strange peace arises, for time is no longer something to resist. It becomes something to listen to. Scientists collect samples from these landscapes, grinding stone to powder, measuring isotope ratios, analyzing bands of iron or carbon inclusions. To them, the rock is data, but even in data, there is story. The echoes remain. A sulfur fractionation line is not just chemistry, it is the memory of an atmosphere without oxygen. A graphite crystal is not just carbon, it is the faintest voice of Archean microbes whose bodies long ago dissolved. Every measurement becomes a translation, a way of letting echoes speak into the present. And yet, like all echoes, they fade. We cannot know everything. The Archean remains primarily silence, with only faint reverberations reaching us. But this too is the nature of echoes. They remind us of absence by carrying only fragments of sound. The landscapes of Greenland, Australia and Canada, holding some of Earth's oldest stones, are echoes not because they tell the whole story, but because they remind us how much has been lost. Standing on these ancient grounds, we are asked not to dominate, not to define, but to listen. The Archean does not reveal itself in monuments of power, but in persistence of survival, in quiet witnesses too stubborn to vanish. And as we listen, we realize that echoes are not only backward-looking, they open questions forward as well. If pieces of this age still stand with us now, what else might the Earth remember? If rocks can carry deep echoes, could the planet itself be holding something closer to a memory than we admit? And so we drift from echoes in landscapes toward a deeper wondering if Earth can endure this long, if it can preserve fragments through fire, ice and abyss. What if the Earth itself remembers quietly, without words, holding its earliest diary within, waiting to be read? From the echoes that linger in our present landscapes, our thoughts drift to something more profound. What if the Earth itself could remember, not only through fragments of stone and isotope ratios, but in the way a living mind remembers, carrying impressions, erasures, and sensations throughout its whole being? The thought feels strange, perhaps impossible. And yet, when we walk across ancient cratons or hold a band of rusted iron once laid down in Archean seas, we sense something more than geology. We sense continuity, as if the planet itself is whispering back to us across billions of years. Memory, as we know it, is fragile. It belongs to minds. It drifts in and out. It fades. But the Earth's version of memory is different. It is slow, patient, carved in patterns too vast to sense directly. Where we capture moments in fleeting images, the Earth records in layers of stone, rain etched into sedimentary grooves, fire preserved in pillow baths, atmospheric changes sealed into sulfur isotopes. Even forgetting, even erasure, becomes part of the memory, the blank spaces reminding us of silence as much as of presence. The Earth forgets, but its forgetting has shape, and that shape too is record. If Earth could remember as a whole, perhaps it does not hold memory in the way we think of it, not as recollection, not as storytelling, but as physicality, in the weight and arrangement of its being. Each tectonic plate, each mountain, each ocean basin is a fragment of recollection. Continents move not simply by force, but as if pulled by the inertia of what came before. Erosion smooths landscapes, with repetitions that feel less like reaction and more like ritual. Could it be that memory is not separate from action but identical to it? That the very shape of the planet is its memory, enacted in real time? In speculative thought, some scientists have suggested that the Earth, viewed broadly, is like a system learning from itself. Feedback loops between atmosphere, oceans, and rock regulate climate. Silicate weathering balances greenhouse gases. Volcanic release counters cooling trends. Though unconscious, these cycles echo memory, as if the planet remembers how to stay balanced, adjusted by eons of trial and error. It is not intention, it is not mind. But perhaps it is persistence. Survival itself becomes a form of memory expressed through continuity. And here, in the Archean, we see Earth at its earliest attempts to remember. The climate teetered on collapse, yet balance returned through chemical dialogue. Oxygen surged, dipped, surged again, until it stayed. Continents broke apart, sank, reformed, until stability held. Simple metabolisms rose and vanished, but the traces of their breath hardened into stone. To us, this looks like history. To the planet, perhaps it was experiment, and experiments carry memory forward. Philosophically, we might ask, what would it mean if the Earth itself remembered us? If our brief presence, our cities, our languages, became folded into its deep geology, not just as ruins, but as memory in the deepest sense. Already our technofossils, plastics, alloys, concrete, will persist far beyond us. Already isotopes altered by our industry are drifting into strata. In billions of years, when most of what we know is gone, the Earth will still carry ratios of carbon shifted by our combustion, will still carry fragments of concrete now reshaped into stone. Whether or not there is anyone to read them, those marks will whisper, they were here. But memory is not permanence. It is always selective. The Earth may remember us, yes, but only as fragments, as echoes. Just as the Archean survives today in rusted iron and zircon grains, our entire epoch may one day be reduced to a layer thinner than paper in the rock record. Perhaps Earth remembers best by paring away detail, by distilling billions of lived moments into a single seam of altered chemistry. Memory becomes minimal, and yet in its reduction it grows more enduring. If Earth could remember, perhaps it also dreams. Dreams not as we dream, images floating in night, but dreams as potential expressed in minerals recombining, tectonic plates shifting to new alignments, atmospheres slowly reshaped by unseen processes. Dreams as slow visions of what could be, unconcerned with the brevity of life upon its surface. The Archean was one such dream, a vision of oceans without animals, of continents trembling into being, of silence punctuated only by fire. To the Earth, it was a long recurring thought. To us, it is memory, distant, fragmentary, but powerful. And so maybe the question is not whether the Earth remembers, but whether we know how to listen. Memory is often misconstrued as clarity, but what if memory is instead necessity? The persistence of information in any form that continues to shape what follows. By that measure, the planet is full of memory, not always legible, not always precise, but always enduring somewhere, somehow, even in silence. To imagine Earth remembering is to see it as more than host. It becomes a continuity within which we are the brief guests, our stories braided into its larger narrative. We are not separate, not apart. We are pages in its vast diary, most of which will one day be unread. But unread does not mean unwritten. Unread simply means remembered in a language different from ours. And so from this reflection we drift forward. If memory lingers in stone, in isotopes, in echoes, then the Archean is remembered not as an ending but as a preparation. Its silence carried futures we live within. Now, its forgetting shaped us before we existed. To imagine Earth remembering leads us naturally toward us. Remembering Earth, an exchange of gazes across time, and from there, to the first inklings of our own dawn, the moment when what would one day become us was already seeded in the planet's earliest patience. From the thought of Earth remembering, we turn toward ourselves, toward the quiet prelude of our own existence, written not in bodies but in environments. The Archean was no dawn of humanity, not even the dawn of animals, and yet it was the first almost dawn of us, the foundation without which we could not have arrived. Every breath we take, every word we speak, every step across continents rests upon conditions first sculpted in those deep alien ages. It is easy to think of history beginning when we recognize familiar forms, shells, forests, footprints, but life's true prelude stretches further back to a world of microbes beneath an oxygenless sky. In those hidden cells, chemistry was rewriting oceans, oxygen was accumulating beneath the surface, continents were breathing into place, and carbon was being drawn down by rains into stone. These were not distant curiosities. They were the preparation of what would become us. Long before thought, memory, or language, the stage itself was being built, piece by piece, by forces unaware of what they were preparing for. Consider oxygen. For hundreds of millions of years it gathered silently, poison to the living but seed to the future. It would one day become the air we depend upon, the invisible foundation of our every heartbeat. Consider iron precipitating into layered formations, painting oceans red, quietly delivering the resources our blood now carries as pigment. Consider continental roots forming beneath Archean volcanoes, surviving billions of years to serve as the ground beneath our cities. The Archean, unknowingly, was laying out blueprints we walk within now, an architecture of survival unfolding without intent. And what of carbon? In those rains that scrubbed carbon dioxide from the air and locked it into stone, Earth was writing the first notes of climate balance. Without such sequestration, the faint young sun paradox would have collapsed into silence. Oceans frozen, life erased. But balance held, precariously, long enough for continuities to form. Out of this chemical rhythm, conditions were stabilized, not for us directly, but for life's gradual expansion. That slow, hidden labor was our inheritance. Everything that followed depended on these earliest negotiations between water, air, and stone. To call it our almost dawn is to admit that it was not about us directly. We were never intended, never the goal. And yet to look back feels intimate. We can trace the chains of cause and effect that connect us to those microbial builders. We carry iron in our blood because oceans rusted. We carry carbon in our bones because Archean air was balanced by rain. We breathe oxygen today because of wastes released by colonies, so small they could never imagine consequence. We are walking testimonials of the Archean, our very biology shaped in worlds that had no thought of us. Philosophically, this unsettles. For what are we, if not extensions of processes so ancient we cannot fathom them? Our identities seem ephemeral compared to the slow patience of evolution across billions of years. And yet, is that not what gives us humility? That our presence is an echo carried forward from a dawn that was never our own, but without which we could not exist. Every human breath is bound to the microbial exhalations of forgotten seas. Every continent we inhabit is anchored in buoyant roots, first formed in Archean fire. Our almost dawn was not light in the sky, but fire in the mantle, oxygen in shallow mats, iron in oceans, rains falling endlessly onto bare rock. What does it mean to belong so deeply to something we cannot recall? Our minds are too brief to hold billions of years, yet our bodies are built from them. We remember indirectly through isotopes, through surviving stones, through the shadows of fossils, not of creatures, but of atmospheres. And perhaps this is enough. Memory does not have to exist in us for us to carry it. We are its continuation, whether knowing or not. And so we stand now, small, brief, fragile, yet tethered by invisible threads to a world of iron seas and copper skies. Against such scale, our histories seem thin, but maybe thinness is the point. We are not the culmination, we are continuity. Our existence is the Earth's way of remembering its Archean dawn, not in stones this time, but in flesh and voice. The Archean was not our dawn, and yet it was. It carried the blueprints of our breath, the seeds of our blood, the balance of our climate, the roots of our continents, and so, though we live billions of years away from it, in a sense we are still standing within it, because this first almost dawn of us never really ended. It lingers, carried forward inside us, beside us, beneath us. And if such distant ages could prepare for futures unseen, what else might still be unfolding now, deep beneath, patiently preparing for a dawn we cannot imagine? From this almost dawn we drift toward the closing of gates, toward the thought of what it means to leave such stories behind, knowing we are made of them, and yet will one day be forgotten by them. From the first almost dawn of us, we arrive at the quiet threshold where imagination and silence meet. The Archean, that vast beginning 4 billion years ago, does not close in neat finality. It does not give us chapters with conclusions. Instead, it lingers, unfinished, just as time itself does. To speak now of closing the gates of time is not to end the story, but to fold it back inward, as though the diary's final page returns to where it began. Stone, silence, and the patient memory of the earth beneath our feet. We carry this journey differently now. When we began, the Archean felt alien, iron seas, orange skies, continents fragile as rafts, microbes clinging invisibly in shallows, and yet, as we drifted through it, something changed. The strangeness found its way into us. Oceans rusting into iron became the iron pulsing in our blood. Microbes exhaling waste became the foundation of the air filling our lungs. Forgotten rains weathering stone became the quiet regulation of a climate that still cradles us. What was once unknowable became intimate, folded deeply into the fabric of our own being. And yet for every connection we found, we also found forgetting. The Archean is 9 parts silence for every 1 part memory. Most of what lived then has been erased without record. Whole continents lost into the mantle, oceans dissolved, atmospheres overturned. What remains are fragments. Zircons no larger than grains of sand, isotopes scribbled faintly into stone, banded iron formations preserved in ridges across Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Through these fragments we read a story older than imagination, and yet we know the story is incomplete. It always will be. The gates of time seldom close with clarity. Perhaps there is humility in this incompleteness. We want narratives that resolve, paths that lead from past to present seamlessly. But the Archean does not offer us that gift. Instead, it reminds us that history is always fragmentary, that endurance is improbable, that forgetting shapes us as much as memory. The gates of time are not locked doors with keys. They are thresholds always slightly open, allowing us glimpses but never certainty. Perhaps the earth keeps it this way as protection. Perhaps silence is the truest archive. And so we imagine the Archean not as a time gone, but as a presence beneath us. Every mountain ridge hides it in roots. Every continent floats upon its deep cratons. Every step across land is a contact with its survival. We live within it still. It has not ended, only evolved, layered upon itself so thoroughly that we forget we are standing on memory. The gates of time are under our feet. They wait, patient and closed to our eyes, but open to our imagination. Closing these gates, then, is not the same as shutting them away. It is learning to let them rest, to stop prying, to accept that some stories are too vast to be wholly known. When we close them gently, they do not vanish. They simply slip into the stillness of night, becoming companions to our sleep rather than puzzles to be solved. To close the gates of time is to recognize their immensity and then to let go. What if, in some distant, unimaginable future, others far beyond us might open these gates again? What if the memory of the Archean is carried not only in rocks, but in echoes that ripple forward endlessly, waiting to be rediscovered? Could there be civilizations far away in time, perhaps not human, who walk upon the same stones, holding fragments of Archean iron without knowing the ancient breaths contained within them? Time does not close absolutely. It folds, it hides, it waits. Its gates may open again in hands we will never see. Standing here in the present, we are both the inheritors of this age and its brief interpreters. Our science gives us whispers, zircons, isotopes, layered bands of stone. Our imagination fills the silences with wonder. Together they form a picture, incomplete yet profound. The Archean becomes not just history, but meditation. A reminder of how fragile survival is, how immense silence can be, how fleeting our own place truly is. To walk in deep time is to accept that we are temporary, and that temporariness is not failure but belonging. As we close the gates of time, we close them gently, carrying fragments with us, the soft patter of Archean rains, the red shimmer of iron seas. The dark basalt plains glistening under methane haze, the microbes gathering in patient mats, exhaling oxygen that would one day make breath possible, the eruptions painting continents, burying, erasing, renewing, and above all the silence, the music of absence that defined the world before voices came. These are what we carry. These are what linger when all else dissolves. And yet, if the Archean could linger through such erasure, what else may endure beyond us? Our voices, our cities, our own signatures carved accidentally into stone will one day be no more than thin seams of chemistry pressed between larger layers. Even we will be echoes. Perhaps one day, someone, something will place a hand on that stone and wonder, as we do now, what was it like then, and perhaps they too will close the gates of time, carrying questions rather than answers, drifting into sleep with curiosity as their final companion. For this is what the Archean leaves us with, not certainty, not clarity, but atmosphere, patience, silence, wonder. The gates do not close firmly. They close like eyes at dusk, soft and unresolved, fading into dreams that carry more mystery than memory. And as the listener sinks into night, perhaps this is the final gift of all, to remember that everything, stone, sea, silence, life, is temporary, and yet for a moment it belongs. The Archean belongs still, beneath us, around us, within us. The gates of time close softly, but not forever. They close as the night closes across the land, quiet, slow, gentle, until only silence remains.